difference that I have from the NDP on this particular concurrence motion. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Question comment. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank our honourable colleague. He is a good soldier. He goes on and on and on, and he quotes lots of things. Well, I'd like to quote something from the media. It's breaking news, and perhaps he'd like to check his phone about a breaking news right now of a Liberal MP that secretly advised a Chinese diplomat in 2021 to delay the freeing of the two Michaels. I would like to ask this honourable colleague for a comment onto that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, I'm sitting here, Mr. Speaker. I've been speaking for the last 15 minutes, not including interruptions. I'm unaware of the breaking news that this member is referencing. I'm looking forward to look into it. But we see, once again here, Mr. Speaker, the exact same rhetoric that comes from Conservatives, the exact same thing that the member from Red Deer Lacombe was trying to do when he, walking through an airport, looking like the hero on his way back to Ottawa, was saying, I'm on my way to Ottawa to fight for you and deal with the agents of Beijing. Come on. That's not what this place is supposed to be about, Mr. Speaker. The rhetoric that comes from Conservatives, including that last question, is intentionally trying to mislead Canadians, and I find it extremely unfortunate.
Questions and comments.
2022, the committee is resuming its study of foreign interference and threats to the integrity of democratic institutions, intellectual property, and the Canadian state. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informing that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of today's meeting. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. First, Kenny Chu, a former member of Parliament, Michelle Junot-Katsura, who is the former chief of the Asia-Pacific Unit for Canadian Security Intelligence Service.
That's the only difference that I have from the NDP on this particular concurrence motion. Thank you.
Victor L.M. Poe,
questions and comments. Question and comment. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and
Dan
thank our honourable
Stanton,
colleague.
who's the former
He is a
executive
good
manager,
soldier. He goes
Canadian
on
Security
and on and on,
Intelligence
and
Service,
quotes lots of
and
things. Well, I'd like to
Arthur
quote something
Wilczynski,
from the
Senior
media.
Fellow,
It's
Graduate
breaking
School
news,
of
and
Public
perhaps
and
he'd like to
International
check his
Affairs,
phone
Faculty
about
of
a
Social Sciences
breaking news
for
right
the
now. A
University
Liberal
of
MP
Ottawa.
that secretly
I
advised a
thank all of you
Chinese
for being
diplomat in
with us today.
2021
We
to
have
delay the freeing
2 hours.
of the two Michaels.
We're going to have 30 minutes of opening statements, 5 minutes each. I'm going to keep to the timelines today so that we can get as much in as we can. Mr. Chu, you have 5 minutes to address the committee. Please commence.
In general, for many years, our national security apparatus has identified foreign interference efforts by the top perpetrator countries as Russia, Iran, and PRC. During my term as an MP, I actively supported and worked with Canadians in the Persian community to tackle foreign interference and coercive transnational repression here. However, I shall share my views and experience using the Chinese Communist Party example as a window into how it is implemented here in our country. The aim of CCP regime shadow operation is to exploit what they see as weakness to advance their interests and influence in our decision-making process, and domestically as well as internationally. Because of language barriers and cultural challenges, we have diaspora communities that feel most comfortable with and even exclusively consume ethnic media contents. Popular CCP-sanctioned monolithic technologies like WeChat also provide a convenient platform to either suppress dissension or promote and spread disinformation. That presents a golden opportunity for the CCP. As filed by Alliance Canada Hong Kong in a 2021 submission and a March 2023 Radio Canada investigative report, the communist regime has successfully monopolized Chinese ethnic media, either through complete takeover or being co-opted via the carrot and stick approach with business interests. With the successful execution of this strategy, CCP has effectively controlled the diaspora community's hearts and minds. In the long run, it perpetrates a false narrative of a complete equivalency of the Chinese Communist Party, China the state, and Chinese the race. Therefore, criticizing the CCP will quickly escalate into anti-Chinese racism. Globally, the CCP is also consistently spreading a lie, weaponizing nationalism that, quote, Western world led by the U.S. is selfishly suppressing a rising China, that CCP miraculous achievements, it's the reason why all ethnic Chinese can finally lift their head high, and that there remains much colonial, imperialistic, anti-Asian racism in these hypocritical Western democracies, and only the CCP's interests align with the welfare and betterment of ethnic Chinese worldwide, unquote. This explains why the recent CSIS whistleblower reports by reputable media such as the Globe and Mail, Global News, and the CBC have been portrayed by some pro-CCP mouthpiece media and commentators as Canada's, quote, deliberate racist acts under the U.S. command to undermine a rising China, unquote. The lack of reliable and reputable fact-checking resources in their language further perpetrates the miscommunication. It sends a deep distrust and resentment of Canadian society in general and pits the we versus they divide and conquer struggle among us. With that long-term foundation laid and continue being laid as we speak, the regime can activate their political influence by spreading and seemingly authoritative commentary or news stories at their right time. For example, in 2021, a complete mischaracterization of my proposed establishment of foreign influence registry was circulated in WeChat and WhatsApp groups that it is anti-Chinese or a pretext of a future Chinese internment effort, or that if elected Prime Minister, the anti-Chinese Aaron O'Toole, then conservative leader, will ban WeChat, jeopardizing the only familial or business link they so rely on. Their goal is twofold: to install a decision makers that they have access to or control of, or to remove those that stand against their efforts, quote unquote, vocal detractors, if you will. To be clear, a beneficiary of these efforts does not necessarily imply collusion. CCP not only honors the age-old philosophy that an enemy's enemy is a friend, they also practice equal opportunity among races, corruption and collusion with anybody willing to submit within or outside of the Chinese community. 2018, Australian Senator Sam Dastyalli resigned in a Chinese government-linked scandal served as a good reminder. Indeed, to link any effort against foreign interference with anti-Asian racism not only plays into the CCP playbook, it is a racist comment in its own, since it implies CCP will only corrupt ethnic Chinese, ignoring all the cries and demands for actions from the very same community, some of whom had taken the great effort in speaking in front of the House committee such as yours. In conclusion, foreign interference and transnational repression are complex geopolitical issues. Unfortunately, in my humble opinion, Canada has run out of time in dithering and procrastinating. This is not the moment for more talks and virtual signaling, but legislative actions that aim to protect Canada, your home, and home to many cultural communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Juno Katsua. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and analysis based on more than 30 years of work, research, investigation, and analysis of Chinese intelligence activities in Canada. I've done this work as a counterintelligence officer, as a security consultant to the private sector, and an academic.
Claim openly with evidence that CSIS has known about Chinese foreign interference in Canada for at least the last 30 years. Every federal governments, from Mr. Mulroney to Mr. Trudeau today, have been compromised by agents of the Communist China. Every government were informed at one point or another. Every government chose to ignore CSIS warning. Every government were infiltrated by agent of influence acting on behalf of the Chinese government. Every government took decisions that are questionable about China and can only be explained by interference exercise from within. Every government let their decision process manipulated by two reasons: partisanship and agent of influence succeeding in controlling the message. Every prime ministers and or their staff chose to ignore the seriousness of the threat. Not only the sitting government has been compromised, but all political parties also have been compromised at one point or another. The inaction of the federal governments led to attack on many municipal and provincial governments. Ultimately, every government has been part of the problem, not part of the solution. And a reminder, not only China practices foreign interference. Again, we have evidence, names, circumstances when all this happened.
The principle of interference is to present temptations to those targeted. This is one of the weaknesses of a democratic system. The Chinese agents have understood this well and have proven that they know how to exploit it. It is up to us to finally give ourselves concrete means to strengthen our defenses. In light of these facts, I would like to propose some thoughts. First, it is imperative to give the country a criminal law on foreign interference defining the activities considered illegal and the penalties that can be incurred. Second, I welcome the initiative to create a national office against foreign interference, but to place it under the Minister of Public Security is not appropriate. I have said it before and I will say it again. All past and present governments have been part of the problem, not the solution. All have been warned and ignored. For this new body to report to a minister is to repeat the same pattern of failure and political interference. This office must be independent, separate from CSIS and the RCMP, and it needs to report directly to the House of Commons with a director appointed by the House. This office must have legislative powers to investigate, search, arrest, and prosecute in a criminal court without having to ask anyone's permission and be able to inform the public without political interference. Furthermore, a budget of $13.5 million over 5 years is not enough. There must be investigators who can cover all regions of Canada, and to do this, having local offices to work not only for the federal government, but also to assist the provinces and municipalities is imperative. I would add that the $48.9 million promised over 3 years to the RCMP to protect communities may have little impact without a national office. Furthermore, the RCMP, like CSIS, cannot be the investigative body since in the current structure, they have not been able to get governments to act in 30 years. So how can we expect this to change tomorrow?
A mandatory process where future election candidates must swear and sign a declaration that they are not under the influence or acting on behalf of a foreign government or entity. This form will clearly warn the possible criminal procedures in case of intentional deception. Similar process must be established for all political staff and volunteers during hiring process. Fourth, eliminate the possibilities for foreigners to vote for the selection of candidates and nominees. This is an obvious nonsense. Fifth, prohibit for a period of 3 to 5 years or all leaving cabinet members and senior public servants from working or participating to any activities or job related to their previous function. En terminant,
in closing, a quick word on the idea of a commission of inquiry. This is not the way to go. A public commission will inevitably reveal the investigative methods of our security services and thus diminish our effectiveness in detecting and neutralizing the threat while putting human sources at risk. Already, with the revelations revealed, we have helped the Chinese services to counter us. It is likely that in the current political climate, attention will be given to the timeline of events seeking to blame the government when its predecessors have all done the same thing. It is time to prioritize national security in a non-partisan manner and protect the future of this nation.
I'm looking forward to answer your question.
Merci, Monsieur Junot-Katsuya.
Thank you, Mr. Junot-Katsuya.
Mr. Manthorpe, sir, you have 5 minutes to address the committee.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm also honored to be amongst such a good raft of witnesses for you. And let me just say that I agree with everything that you've heard so far this morning. I think those are both excellent presentations, and I'm sure it will be the same from the other witnesses. I'm going to be very brief and basically just outline what is covered in my 2019 book, Claws of the Panda. Relations at the official level between Canada and the Chinese Communist Party began in China in the 1930s, over 80 years ago. What is remarkable is how little the attitudes towards the relationship and the objectives of both sides have changed over those 8 decades. In their early encounters with Chinese communist cadres, Canadian officials showed a fundamental naivety about the purposes of the party that continues to this day, despite all the evidence that they are delusional. But from the start, the Canadians saw the communists as a reformist rather than a revolutionary party. They nursed then, and many still do, the hope and expectation that the Canadian models of politics, administration, and law would be templates for reform that the Chinese Communist Party would follow. The Huawei affair, which started just as my book Claws of the Panda was being published, should have dispelled that blind optimism. It should have made it clear, beyond doubt, that we have no shared values with the Chinese Communist Party, and that we cannot have a normal relationship with a regime whose first instinct, when there is a problem, is to take hostages. The Chinese Communist Party's objectives in the relationship have been equally consistent. First was and is to make Canada a supporter of Beijing on the international stage where possible, and to minimize Ottawa's criticism if there is no support. Second was and is to gain access through Canadian universities and research institutes to Canadian and United States technology, especially technology with military uses. Third was and is to get unrestricted access to Canadian agricultural and natural resources. The Chinese Communist Party does not believe in market economics. Fourth was and is to have open access to Canada's market for Chinese manufactured goods. Fifth, and critically important in my view, was and is to be able to control and use Canadians of Chinese heritage, especially those advocating for reform in China. By my count, the Chinese Communist Party has achieved all its objectives in Canada, while we have hardly had a shot on goal. I will end there, and I will be happy to try to answer any questions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manthorpe. Well under time, which I appreciate, because it'll give us more time for questions. Mr. Ho, you have 5 minutes, sir, on video to address the committee. Go ahead, please.
Yes. As a retired journalist working for the Chinese Canadian Media Organization for 25 years, I observed that the most efficient way for the CCP to control Chinese language media is to co-opt top management of the targeted company. Then the editorial policy of that medium will always follow the party line in China. Here are several tactics of CCP usually used in local Chinese community. First, one, propaganda. In early days, short propaganda radio programs prepared by the United Front Work Department were broadcasted by Radio AM 1320 in Vancouver. Such efforts has been expanded now to full-page ads in local Chinese papers to demonstrate massive support on PRC draconian policies, to embed pro-PRC media personnel in various Chinese language media to speak well of the PRC narratives, influence Chinese language media CEOs and editors by inviting them to tea at the Chinese consulate compound, and by leverage via advertising dollars. 3. Arouse a distorted sense of nationalism towards motherland by exploiting selected parts of BC history to reinforce ideas of Western imperialism, colonialism, or racism towards Chinese ethics. 4. Identity politics. People of a particular race and culture develop political agendas that are based upon these identities. Identity politics is deeply connected with the idea that some groups in society are oppressed and begins with analysis of that oppression. 5. Magnifying the narratives and success of PRC, propagating the CCP mantra that We are into an era of a rising East and declining West. 6. Disinformation. Accuse the West of treating assumption as facts, of being jealous of China's success to the point of unfair trade practices, say like Huawei, TikTok, and of stigmatizing the entire Chinese community by the recent suggestion of a foreign influence registry bill, etc. 7. Polarize and divide the community by a choice of pro-PRC news commentators who would reiterate the failures of the West, and by the reference to the presence of patriots and traitors in the context of Hong Kong. 8. During election, assist by supporting candidates favored by PRC and by not interviewing candidates critical of CCP, say like Kenny Chiu. 9. Establish CCP's own Chinese language media in a Canadian soil. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ho. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Stanton. You have 5 minutes, sir, to address the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members. My insight and understanding of PRC foreign interference comes from 32 years of operations with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, most of which was in what we called counterintelligence. I worked in CI against hostile states, both in the field and in headquarters, for a number of years. And this also includes what we refer to as state-driven foreign interference. When I started working was in the Cold War, and espionage was the all-consuming threat in the West and in Canada in particular. That was what we worked against various state actors. And there's been an evolution since about the implosion of the Soviet Union, where in fact espionage has become rather passé. It's high risk. It's very difficult to do against hard targets. You have to get people to commit treason. And it's a lot easier with foreign influence. And so what we've seen is, in the last 30 years, is that foreign interference has eclipsed classic espionage as a national security threat, both in terms of its scope and its speed. Why risk stealing another state's secrets when you can influence and manipulate the targeted country's policymakers? You can get close to what we consider the soft underbelly of a state through our democratic institutions. And the People's Republic of China, in this effort, are the A-team. They are the best at this. Their level of sophistication, confidence bordering on arrogance has made them probably the most daunting threat from a foreign intelligence perspective. So while China continues to play chess, Canada plays whack-a-mole. We need to raise our game. Now, there's been some talk recently that we don't have any legislative hammer to hit foreign interference with. There isn't legislation like with espionage and terrorism, and I respectfully disagree with that. If you look at the Security of Information Act, particularly at the back of it, Section 20, subsection 1, I'll just read a little bit of it to you, and Section 3, you have the language that is appropriate, in my opinion, for prosecuting foreign interference. Section 3.1, prejudice to the safety or interest of the state. Anyone who commits offense punishable by 2 years or more to advance a political objective or to benefit a foreign entity. We move to 20, subsection 1. It's an offense if for the benefit of a foreign entity, any inducement or attempt to induce the cause to increase the capacity of a foreign entity that is reasonably likely to harm Canadian interests. So these offenses easily are captured by the Security of Information Act, in my opinion. And I think perhaps this committee or others might want to take a look at some of that. I've highlighted that in the legislation. So we know now this is an existential threat. What really has been done? What's been done since the allegations came out in November? Well, there's been the proposal for a foreign agent registry listing, which has merit. Well, unless I'm mistaken, there already is a bill in the Senate, there 237, which is a foreign agent registry bill that's been there since August. Why don't we just move it to the Senate, and why don't we just move it to the House of Commons instead of going across the country and having town halls to see what people think of it? I don't mean to be facetious, but I really think if the government wants to have a registry, and I know a lot of Canadians want to, we've already done some groundwork there. We're allocating millions of dollars to the RCMP, I learned last week, with no investigative strategy, no prosecution strategy. We're just saying, here, take this money and use this. 32 years in national security work. Every time we've had a crisis, every time we've had an incident, that's what the government's done. We'll throw money at the RCMP and we'll say, you folks have got to sort that out. And I don't think that's really an appropriate response. We haven't had a national security policy renewed since 2004. That's the first time we ever had a national security policy written. The threat landscape in this country has changed enormously in the last 20 years. Qualitatively, new threats with AI, all sorts of things, and I think Canadians deserve something like that, and it should be a national security policy that is China-centric. I don't mean to sound partisan. I don't mean to blame any particular government. I worked this threat with the PRC for many, many years. I actually was the national program manager 12, 13 years ago, and it was a different government at the time. And the reaction to foreign interference reporting, as I think has been suggested earlier, was no different than it was today. Nobody home. There really wasn't much of a response. So this really isn't a partisan issue for me. I think this threat and how the government's going to react or reacts to it historically has transcended party and transcended time. And what we really need is a more holistic approach to pushing back against that threat. And finally, I want to say I'm so delighted to be here to speak today, but particularly with Mr. Ho and Mr. Chu as panel members, and the other fellows as well, of course. But I think it's extremely important that we have Chinese Canadians to have a platform to talk about what's been going on. They need to have a voice, and not simply as some PR exercise to find out, what they think now and then. But these are the people that have been in the crosshairs of the People's Republic of China regime for 30, 40 years, and they're the people that need to come forward, and they need to have the trust and confidence that there's going to be outcomes and there's going to be a follow-up if they're going to take a risk and come forward and say what's happening. So I think not only the government, but I think Canadians, we need to listen to our Canadian Chinese community for once and hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Wilczynski, like a volcano, you look like you're ready to explode there. You've listened to the other speakers. You're the last. No, 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to reiterate what Mr. Stanton said and thank Mr. Ho, Mr. Chu, and Mr. Manford for sharing their experience with foreign interference. It is absolutely essential to listen to the concerns raised by Chinese communities and other communities that are targeted by this interference so that we can counter activities by foreign governments. Let me share with you that in over 30 years in the public service, I have observed the workings of governments from many angles. As Director General of Border Policy at Public Safety, I negotiated security agreements with the United States. I've been the Director General of Security and Intelligence at what is now Global Affairs, an ambassador to a NATO ally, and the Director General of Intelligence Operations at the Communication Security Establishment. I am intimately familiar with the workings of the Canadian security and intelligence community.
I've been a consumer of intelligence and have managed intelligence production. I have done so with a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. The complexity of foreign interference requires us to understand the links between a wide range of interconnected issues. Foreign interference by hostile state actors, such as the People's Republic of China, is a profound challenge, as we have heard. The security and intelligence community has been responding and speaking about this threat for years. Nevertheless, as my colleagues have so clearly pointed out, much more can be done to address this threat. I'm glad that we're having this national conversation on foreign interference, and we need to listen, as I said, to the lived experiences of affected communities and individuals. What is regrettable is how we got here and how this conversation is unfolding. The illicit disclosure of intelligence, the awkward response by some in government, and hyperbolic accusations against government and its institutions has resulted in a toxic environment that has impeded our ability to address the threat. The tone and content of the conversation has further shaken Canadians' confidence in our democratic institutions. The debate has been reduced to sound bites and tweets. It has become a vehicle for partisanship rather than a forum where we can work together to confront foreign interference, build resilience in our institutions, and restore the shaken confidence in our democracy. Disclosures may have focused national attention on foreign interference, but have also caused damage to our efforts to confront the threat and are incompatible with defending democracy. When, as public servants, we gain access to classified information, we swear an oath of secrecy. It is an oath to follow the law and a range of compliance measures. To violate that oath, with little understanding of the predictable consequences of disclosures, is profoundly irresponsible and likely illegal. While I completely understand the frustration about the pace of addressing foreign interference, disclosure of classified intelligence is illegal for a reason. It compromises techniques. It compromises sources and makes them less likely to cooperate with security and intelligence officials. When government officials leak intelligence, it undermines human rights of individuals' name. And as the committee responsible for access to information, privacy, and ethics, I think that would be particularly of concern to the members of this committee, Mr. Chair. That information is released without due process, without a presumption of innocence, and with no ability to effectively defend themselves. All of this impedes both the specific investigations themselves, as well as the ability to nurture sources in the long run. It is also fundamentally anti-democratic. You cannot say that you are defending democracy while breaking the laws passed by Parliament. As the former Assistant Deputy Minister for People, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at CSE, I know operational security is essential to persons with origins in hostile states. For them, it is a matter of personal and family safety. Disclosures affect them directly and profoundly. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, because of these issues, I have supported calls for a public inquiry. We need an impartial inquiry to examine what happened and to ensure that we have the tools necessary to preserve the resilience of our democratic institutions in the future. An inquiry would have the opportunity to examine classified information. It should be coordinated with reviews by NCIRA and NCICOP. It should make recommendations that consider the entire threat, not just what happened in 2019 and 2021.
The threats to our democracy are complex, foreign interference is evolving, an inquiry will provide Parliament with options to mitigate the threats and ensure Canadians have confidence that the representatives reflect our popular will. The only ones benefiting from what is happening now are the enemies of democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. For anyone who's been following the committee and for the benefit of the witnesses, I'm kind of old school when it comes to interaction. I don't believe that we need to go through the chair all the time. So any of the questions that happen can be direct. The answers can be direct to the members as well. So with that being said, we're going to start with Mr. Barrett for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to the witness panel for joining us this morning and providing us with your expertise. Very nice to see you, Mr. Chu, here today, a former colleague of ours. And thanks for making the trip. It's quite early back home in BC for you, so happy to see you here. I'd like to start with a question for you, Mr. Junokatsu. Do you have evidence of interference or interference attempts, or evidence that Canadian governments have been informed of these activities?
Yes, but I don't have them with me since I was with CSIS. It's remained with CSIS.
Okay. So you don't have any information that you'd be able to transmit to the committee for its review?
Other than the normal briefing has been provided at various time through the last 30 years, all the senior command or the chain of command has spoken to various governments at one point or another. No, I don't have it. It was regular briefing given according to the seriousness of what we had discovered at that period of time.
Do you know how many federal ridings have been targeted by the communist regime in Beijing?
Through the last 30 years or the recent?
I'm interested in both numbers, actually.
Well, through the years, we have seen similar writing constantly being targeted, particularly where there was a domination or a great number, I should say, of Chinese-Canadian residents. These were the hunting ground of the consular office. The work is done by consular officers most of the time, and like I said, we have a certain number, but they were all the time the same ones targeted. And they would fluctuate through time when a specific MP or candidates would present itself newly against the Chinese government, when it was not usual to have aggressions or resistance coming from that writing. But if somebody became vocal, then suddenly they would deploy some effort. But it was fairly stable throughout the entire Canada.
Would you believe it to be productive for you to furnish this committee with a list in writing of those writings?
I could try to put it together.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with the 2022 case of Christine Lee in the United Kingdom? She was the subject of an alert by MI5?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I see Mr. Stanton is nodding. Sir, are you familiar with that case?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I read it. I was following it quite closely, so I read all the media on it.
So you're aware that House of Commons Speaker Hoyle issued an alert to members of Parliament to warn of interaction with Ms. Lee?
Yeah.
Similarly, a similar situation, are you aware of an alert that was issued by the Speaker as the result of information by MI5 concerning Russian influence attempts the year prior?
If I'm thinking about the same one, there was a case in Britain, and I think MI5 was involved, but I think from what I've read in the media, it's of questionable accuracy whether this is some, I think, a British subject who's claimed that he reported to MI5 and they didn't take seriously what he was saying?
No, the case that I'm referring to was influence activities targeting 100 members of the UK House by Russian state actors looking to color their perspective of activities of the government of Ukraine. But we'll stick with the situation that you're familiar with.
Okay.
And that's of Miss Lee. So this issue was raised by MI5, brought to the Speaker of the House, and then members were warned. Why do you think that that's not a practice that's employed here in Canada? We've heard testimony here this morning already that there are state actors working at all levels of government in all political parties, and I think that is surprising. That everyone would say, oh, it must be in another party, it must have been another government, and members couldn't be blamed for that because we have an intelligence service that's never told us otherwise. So why don't we have that process in place here? And if you could keep your remarks pretty tight, I'll try and get to the other two speakers.
I'll be real brief. I think that particular case in Britain was so egregious that they had intelligence that the money that was coming from the United Front Work Department in the PRC through this British citizen going right into an MP's campaign fund. And I think there was probably a lot more going on, but it wasn't hitting any legal thresholds. So the best the British could do was send out this all-points bulletin to everybody, identifying her, basically saying, stay away, stay clear. She's a foreign influence actor. Now, I wouldn't say the allegations we have in Canada, based on what looks to be pretty sketchy information coming from the media, dribs and drabs, that the Canadian government would issue something like that. That's just my opinion. But I think the British case was so blatant, it provoked that.
I'm out of time, but I'll circle back on this issue and give you an opportunity to respond, Mr. Wilczynski and Mr. Junoketsu. Thanks for your response.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And we've got roughly an hour and a half worth of questioning here, so you'll have another chance. Mr. Baines, you're up next for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, as technology advances and tactics evolve and foreign state relations evolve, like we've heard today. I do believe the threat to democracy is a lot to do with disinformation and misinformation from foreign state actors, non-state actors, and even domestically here. So, we've heard that this has been going on for a long-standing time. So thank you all for joining us here today and for this very important study. My first question is to Mr. Wilczynski, if I said that correctly. We have a strong, vibrant Chinese diaspora in the city that I live in, Richmond, from where Mr. Chu is also from. Some families have been here for well over 100 years, while some are first-generation Canadians. You wrote in the Ottawa Citizen that Canadians of Chinese descent are the primary victims of interference from the CCP. Can you elaborate on that for the committee? I think we heard a little bit about it before as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. The reason I wrote that is based a lot on what you've already heard from, quite frankly, the other witnesses that have spoken firsthand about how they have experienced some of those forms of pressure. And I think that there are many instances in the public domain written by members of the community that have highlighted and enumerated the various ways in which interference has negatively affected, whether it's through intimidation, whether it's through coercion. There have been lots of elements in the public domain. And I think that that's why I think it's really important, and why I'm so pleased that Mr. Chu, Mr. Ho, and Mr. Manthorpe have all been here to share that sort of experience and that research that they have done in terms of the effects that manipulation has had on the community. There are unfortunately too many pressure points that can be exercised by hostile states, and we have to be mindful of them. And I think that's why it's important for us to listen to members of the community as we craft strategies to respond to that kind of threat.
And on that note, are there other communities that you think are impacted in the same way?
Yes, and again, it's been mentioned at this table. I do think that, and this is all in the public domain. You don't need to look at classified information because the communities themselves have spoken about it. I believe that the Iranian community has spoken very directly about how they have been affected by foreign interference. We have seen in many instances, also in the public domain, you don't need to go for classified information, how Putin's regime in Russia has tried to influence a wide range of issues that are of interest to that state. And it affects not only, I think, members of ethno-cultural communities, but other targeted communities that might be vulnerable to the actions of those hostile states. So I'll elaborate on that if you would like. Specifically on the last one, I have also in the public domain, I have been particularly critical of the actions of the Russian government as it comes to be targeting the LGBTQ2+ community and trying to highlight, amplify, and specifically undermine Canadians' support for and social cohesion around the equality rights for that historically marginalized community. For me, that might not necessarily be interference so much as malign influence, but it is a hostile activity by a state actor that I think does negatively affect specific Canadians.
And how as MPs can we protect ourselves from bad actors when we aren't provided the tools? So I think one of the issues is, even if we proactively reach out to whether it's public safety agencies or anyone, and we try to ask, like, okay, who do we stay away from? We're not really, that information isn't shared because, quite frankly, that it could compromise something. So what can we do as MPs?
Well, I think having these kinds of sessions is profoundly important, and having officials, both current and previous, from the national security and intelligence community to share what they can in a public environment about what the threat is. Personally, I've also believed that there can be far more transparency from Canada's security and intelligence communities. We can and have the ability to speak to the public, to parliamentarians, and to others around the issues of foreign interference in, I think, a more regular and more frank way. I think that part of the challenge has been a long history of reticence and risk aversion when it comes to having those conversations. And I think part of the effects of that history of risk aversion in terms of regularly and more forthrightly having those conversations is that many Canadians, and unfortunately a number of parliamentarians, don't have a deep understanding of the way security and intelligence works and how we can work more effectively together to counter the threat posed by hostile state actors and other threats to Canada's national security.
Okay, how much time?
Less than a minute.
In the same article that I referenced before, you discuss how disclosure of classified documents undermines efforts to address foreign interference. Can you expand on why that is?
Yes. I think that, again, when one sees illicitly disclosed intelligence, there is a lot that intelligence services can determine by having access to that information. They can figure out what the source of the information is. They can figure out who a potential person was that was seeking the information in the first place. So compromising individuals within the security and intelligence community themselves. It can enable, once they acquire that knowledge, they can develop strategies to avoid that similar tactic in the future. And when they avoid those tactics, when those tactics evolve, the ability for security and intelligence services to maintain access, to have transparency and visibility into what they are doing, whether it's through human sources, as happens for organizations such as CSIS, or through signals intelligence, if there's disclosure, again, targets of that intelligence collection can modify their behavior in a way that closes Canada's and our ability to see what they're doing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilczynski and Mr. Baines. Monsieur Villemure, vous avez 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Mr. Villemure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being with us, and welcome back, Mr. Juno Katsuya. I have a few questions for you, and maybe just a yes or no answer, because I have quite a few questions. You stated that all federal governments were compromised by China. Yes? Yes. All governments were informed. Yes. They all chose to ignore CSIS warnings. Yes. They were infiltrated by agents by the Chinese government. Yes. Governments made questionable decisions with regards to this interference. Yes. All governments up till now have been a part of the problem. Yes. You mentioned legislation. The Hong Kong legislation for 2020, is that good? Australia 2018. Yes, I think that would be a good start. But Australia has had this legislation for 5 years, and their agents can use it. It can teach us how we can improve things. They have a sunset clause of 5 years. And so we could find some inspiration there. The United States and England have some interesting legislation that we could look to as well in order to have Canadian legislation. You stated as well that an investigation board in its current form would not be good because it is not independent. Yes, so it needs to be independent from the government, CSIS, and the RCMP. Correct. How can that be created? How can this independent office be created? Answer: it's similar to what we have with the Auditor General, somebody who is named by the House of Commons and would report to the House of Commons. But it's to be an investigative office to bring back the integrity to our democratic system that we need. It's essential for Canadians and for our allies. It's important to have that independence and that flexibility, and there needs to be the power to investigate. Somebody who will be there to support what Mr. Wazinski said, to support transparency, which is something that we're lacking. That transparency, for too long in Canada, or that lack of transparency, didn't allow us to share warnings with the population. When CSIS wanted to warn companies, as MI5 does, for example, have a national conference in order to give warnings or share information, well, the opposite was done here and told CSIS that they needed to inform only the government, but CSIS informed the government and nothing happened. Thank you. Microphone, please. The interpreter cannot hear. It would be a great challenge. AI would allow us to get information and identify targets for countries that are against us. It would allow us to collect a lot more data and to target people who could be victims of that foreign interference. The microphone is not working. The interpreter cannot hear. Mr. Villemur, your microphone is not working.
Est-ce qu'on peut faire un...
Can we do a test because interpreters cannot hear?
Est-ce qu'il y a deux qui sont ouvertes? Oui. J'ai arrêté le temps aussi.
I stopped your time, Mr. Villemur.
Check, check, check. I think this one, c'est celui-là. OK. Parce qu'il y a deux ouverts ici. Ouais, mais sont gelés. Sont gelés? Bon. OK. Non, il veut vraiment pas. Désolé pour ça. OK, celui-là ici? Oui, celui-là.
Pour les interprètes, est-ce que...
Can the interpreters hear? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Villemur. Mr. Chu, you mentioned that you proposed C-282. What happened with that bill?
Nothing. It's just sat on the House of Commons floor, and with the Prime Minister pulling the plug on 43rd Parliament, it just went away.
Est-ce que vous avez eu des...
Were there any consequences for you personally for tabling such a bill?
As I mentioned during the election, there had been significant amount of disinformation being spread, especially with the diaspora Chinese community through WeChat primarily, but also on WhatsApp. And I've been mischaracterized as somebody who's anti-Chinese and even hating Chinese. That I must not be allowed to be re-elected, myself and also then Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole.
Donc, vous êtes le premier.
So, you're sharing your testimony here with us, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Donc,
can you say that you were a victim of foreign interference during the previous election?
I would say it played a role in my defeat, and I was actually glad that there was a whistleblower in CSIS, because to a certain extent it confirmed my subjective observation, and also the intelligence that we, the local campaign, have received and reported to CSIS all along, even though that CSIS has never got back to us.
Donc, vous croyez?
So you believe that your opponent had an advantage?
Yes, that he is the beneficiary of the disinformation.
Okay. Croyez-vous que ce soit...
Do you believe that it's a conflict of interest that your opponent is here today?
That is a question I think it's better answered by my opponent, who is sitting here in the meeting.
D'accord.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Your time is up.
J'ai arrêté le temps.
I had stopped your time and restarted it, so it has been 6 minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Green, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Obviously, lots has been reported on publicly, lots of opinions floating around. It's good to have some subject matter expertise. I particularly enjoy the opportunity to have former members of our security apparatus here before us. I talk often about the duty of candor, which you are legislated to extend to the courts. I wish we had a deeper commitment from our security apparatus to have the same duty of candor to Parliament. Perhaps we may be able to avoid situations like this in the future. Mr. Stanton, In an interview in CBC Radio, you stated that Canada needs to amend its CSIS Act to empower national security agencies to deal with foreign influence, not just foreign interference. And I think that's an important point. Can you please explain the difference between foreign influence and foreign interference?
So I just missed the last few words. I don't remember suggesting the CSIS Act be amended, but are you just asking me what's the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, good question. There's sort of two types of foreign interference. The first one, which is kind of the easy one, is where the foreign state is basically targeting the diasporic communities relating to homeland issues. This could be manipulation, intimidation, and they don't want to talk about it, and they're used. And so CSIS will target that type of activity, and it's usually dealt with fairly well. It's a less nuanced threat than the other foreign interference. The other foreign interference, probably the reason we're here in these committee meetings, is where you've got the state targeting 3 levels of government, targeting politicians, targeting journalists, all sorts of walks of life, and using clandestine methods. There has to be clandestine activity, otherwise it's simply lobbying. And that's why there's been, I would say, such a lack of government reaction to the reporting over years, because if you look at it at a cursory glance, it appears to be just lobbying, and what's the big deal? Don't you people have more important things to talk about? But if you work it for a long while, and if you use that criteria of clandestinity, where the agenda of the foreign state is not clear to the target, then you can see the threat manifestation. And so that's what we're dealing with more, is the other type of foreign interference, which is very hard to identify and can be difficult to counter. Although I do say we have legislation that can be brought into bear, as opposed to the other foreign interference, which is a little more in your face. And that's where you have a representative of foreign state directly intimidating part of that community in Canada.
And for the purpose that you had referenced AI, I attended a workshop this week on Russian interference and Russian actors online, particularly with troll farms and social media. We know that at least in the cursory ray through the convoy, there had been massive spikes in online presence from Russia in that regard. Can you maybe just share the way in which technology and social media have helped blur the lines between influence and interference in terms of being able to know what is clandestine?
I have to say, actually, that's not an area I really have a lot of background on in terms of the technology aspect of disinformation, but
I can try and answer part of that. I think that, again, the online environment is obviously fairly complex, and it's evolving. I think the important part to understand is when it's inauthentic behavior, when countries use various tools to amplify either covertly messages that they know run counter to the interests of the countries that they're targeting, or specifically amplify their own interests. It is a combination of, again, inauthentic activity with like things such as bots, but it also can be understanding that they've cultivated a range of supportive actors within a state that will amplify those messages for it. So sometimes what would be inauthentic behavior may actually look authentic because it is being amplified by legitimate actors in a certain state. It's all going to be made much more complex, as colleagues have mentioned, by AI. Everything from deep fakes, the ability, I was on the front page of the Citizen the other day, when images and videos are going to be manipulated in such a way that it'll be very difficult to tell the difference, what is real, what is fake. Using those kinds of tools in combination with the kind of amplification they can use in an online environment is going to make it particularly challenging, I think, for average citizens and also for national security and intelligence organizations to be able to constrain and address that behavior. It's something that we have to pay particular attention to into the future.
If I recall, there's a famous Steve Bannon quote that talks about, cognitive warfare, trying to create complete chaos and disorder. This was coming from somebody who at the time was a key American advisor to an American regime. We've spent a lot of time focused on China. Can we perhaps take a moment and step back and just maybe provide a bit of an overview about other international actors, both those that we may consider to be friendly and allies and hostile actors, because it feels like we're missing a pretty significant part of the equation here when we only focus on one country, given the global complexity of this kind of zero-sum game.
If I can, I'll just jump very, very quickly on that. I am particularly worried about non-state actors, and particularly non-state actors from friendly states. I think that it doesn't take a big stretch to see how ideologically motivated violent extremist organizations, particularly those based in the United States, are trying to amplify certain messages that divide, that target minority communities, whether or not it's promoting anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, undermining democratic principles and values. Lots of folks are out there doing so in a non-transparent way. They're not state actors, so therefore the ability for governments like ours to address it are a challenge, and that's one of the things that I think an inquiry should look at as well.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. Mr. Green, we're going to move to our second round of questioning and start with Mr. Kirk. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and let me thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today and talking about this very important subject. Mr. Chu, it's good to see you again, and as a former colleague, it's nice to have you before this committee. I did want to provide you maybe a little bit of an opportunity just to share your experience, what the attacks against you and your personal character looked like, specifically during the last election, and the issues surrounding your proposal for a foreign agents registry. If you could unpack in about a minute or so the impacts that had both you professionally and personally.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's good to see everybody as well. I think I would characterize it as an isolation process. Partly it's due to the COVID pandemic, but on the other hand, I used to serve on the Chinese ethnic media quite frequently and actively. But during my term, especially after I tabled the private member bill for an influence registry, I've been given the cold shoulder in many of the Chinese media, and they don't invite me to their talk shows. And even though they open their lines for criticism of my bill, and all that culminated during the election of this disinformation that, I haven't never been to Xinjiang, so how could I be voting with the rest of the parliamentarian that there is a genocide fulfilling the definition as by the UN? And also, why would I hate my own race, Chinese, that I actually put into place this Chinese registry, this foreign influence registry? It served as a big impact because I left my profession as the software development middle management personnel, and it's difficult to get back to my profession. However, I'm actually glad that this issue was being able to table on the national discussion scene has been previously mentioned. To many of us, this may sound like everything, everywhere, all at once. But to many of us in the community, it's everything, everywhere, all the time.
Much, Mr. Chu, and I'd like to dig down a little bit on the ethnic media side of things. And Mr. Ho, you had mentioned some about that. Could you describe for the benefit of the committee how this process is used or weaponized for the benefit of the communist dictatorship in Beijing?
Oh yeah. The basic principle for the CCP is to intimidate the so-called quote-unquote hostile voices in our Chinese community. And on the other hand, they manipulate the disinformation or misinformation, even fake news on their social media, like WeChat, like other, even TikTok, to spread the official propaganda to, just sidetrack the core problem. For example, in the COVID-19 era, they spread the anti-Asian hate campaign. This is a national campaign, even a transnational campaign, even in United States, anti-Asian hate campaign, and put the agenda into a racial issue rather than a pandemic, the public health issue. And on the election period, they just color the anti or opposite views in the Chinese community, that is anti-CCP action or commentary as a racial problem. And just
if I could, I hate to interrupt, but time is short here. Just a quick follow-up to that. Is this something that, because it's often in languages certainly that many Canadians wouldn't understand, Mandarin, Cantonese, etc., is this something that is the sort of thing that hides in plain sight, Mr. Ho?
Quick answer, please, Mr. Ho.
Oh, yeah. This is an ethnic language problem. So the mainstream society have no idea on what happened in our Chinese community.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Curate.
Past years.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fergus, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would also like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I would like to start with Mr. Wilczynski. You said that the way that things happened creates an issue for public safety and is a violation of human rights in Canada. Can you tell us more? I tried to explain a little earlier. The thing that is fundamental for me is respecting legislation. It's fundamental to our democracy. We respect legislation in place. They give us a framework on how to act as agents of public security. We have the ability to carry out investigations and ways to advance our interests.
Do not follow the law. When they do not respect the rules by which we have been appropriately constrained and the compliance that we have put in place to measure our behavior, the effects are multiple, particularly, I think, on human rights of individuals. So when it's a government official using the powers, the authorities to access information, and then on their own, outside of the framework of the laws that govern us, decides to provide that information without context and without explanation and without analysis to a public domain, that violates a whole range of not only their obligations, but the rights of the individuals named in those disclosures, the rights to privacy, the rights to due process. And I think that is profoundly troublesome when people working in security and intelligence in particular, an enterprise that has had a challenging history in Canada, to do so outside the rule of law, again, is why I think it's fundamentally anti-democratic. And I do want to pick up just, sorry, very, very, very quickly on the earlier question, because it's related to it, like one of the effects. And I mentioned it a bit in my statement. We in the security intelligence community need far greater diversity in our ranks, precisely so that we are able to understand language, cultural context, to be able to provide the kind of insight that is essential. But when members of those communities feel that we have not lived by the rule of law, where we have not protected them to the extent that we need to, our ability to entice them to come and join us and be members of the security intelligence service is negatively affected, and that in turn negatively affects our ability to be effective protectors of Canadian national interests.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, and I saw many people nodding. Mr. Stanton, you talked a lot in the media about these CSIS leaks, quote unquote. Do you believe that these leaks are coming from CSIS? Why or why not?
No, I don't. I don't believe they're coming. And I'll be careful how I answer this because I've been following this quite closely. You've got two different lines of, we'll call it reporting with allegations, and there's qualitative differences in it. And people that work in intelligence and professions like CSIS, they don't get worked up about outcomes. You work counterterrorism. In some cases, you're indifferent really whether someone's going to be arrested and go to jail. I remember when 18 Soviet diplomats were kicked out, and I was actually working the Soviet section. I was working the KGB desk. And I think I was saddened for about 3 weeks that it had to happen because there was all sorts of investigative equities in there and all sorts of things that go on in counterintelligence beyond kicking a diplomat out. The same with someone being arrested or charged or various things. People that work in intelligence are professional. They're not thinking about outcomes that some policymaker may or may not carry. And I know that because I spent 32 years in there. I know the culture. But I also look at some of the stuff that's been in the media where we now have this leaker idolatry, where they're sort of held up as patriots who are sort of outraged by this egregious cover-up and that they're going to now protect Canadians through the leakage. That also doesn't sound like people that I know and a culture that I worked with for many, many years. And I mean, I could read a lot into the testimonial in the Globe. I can read a lot into the Globe's editorials on the subject as well. There's a little bit of a slant towards Essa and Leavelin and things like that, a little bit partisan. So I sort of have an idea in my mind where these leaks are coming, in some cases where they're coming through various filters to the Warrior Reporter. In some cases, it may be a document. And I'm quite confident that the organization I spent a lot of time in is not the source of those leaks. Some of it could be attributed, maybe some third party, but I don't believe that the documents are coming from the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Stan. Merci, Monsieur Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Villemur, you have 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manthorpe, I greatly appreciated your comments. You talked a lot about trust, confidence. Considering the current situation and leaks, allegations, and all those kinds of things, what could help us to build trust in our institutions?
That's a very broad question, and I appreciate it. I'm actually in the middle of writing another book about the problems of Canadian democracy, which maybe we can talk about when the book comes out. But I think we do have a problem of trust in our institutions and our democratic institutions that goes beyond foreign interference. And I think that there have been several people have mentioned this morning that it's not just the People's Republic of China that has perhaps gone beyond the bounds of lobbying and into the area of serious interference in Canadian public life. And I think that perhaps we do need a registry just for that reason, that it is this is a general problem and not something deeply concerned with or only concerned with the People's Republic of China. But I think the level of trust in our institutions has degraded over the last 20, 30 years for various reasons, perhaps more than is appropriate to go in with this committee today. But I wrote a book which came out in 2020 called Restoring Democracy, which looked at the whole period from the end of the Cold War and the various pressures on democracy in the last 30 years. My latest book, which hopefully will come out next year, sort of deals particularly with Canada in that context. But I suspect that this may not be a matter for this committee at this moment. But I'll happily answer any other questions you have.
Merci beaucoup, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manthorpe. Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Mr. Green?
Thank you. Mr. Stanton, could you maybe, picking up on this line of questioning, could you perhaps expand on other foreign agents or countries or actors that are out there that we should be focused on? My concern, and maybe you can comment on this because I've heard a lot about it, is that we're solely focused on China, and I think in doing so, we may miss the broader picture. Can you comment on that?
Sure, great question. I think we're solely focused on China because it is, as I said, the A-team when it comes to foreign interference. There is absolutely no comparison in terms of scope and qualitative differences. But, one of my colleagues alluded to Iran. We've seen a shift in Iranian interference where they're now contracting out in the private sector. This is in the media, both in Canada, U.S., and Britain. They're using private investigators to follow people. And so there's some shifts in how they do this, which is related to harassing and doing worse with dissidents. Russia's always been a player, but Russia's very strong on the intel and their intelligence services. It's somewhat different than the way they do things than with China. One country I'll say is India. India does foreign interference in Canada. We've seen this. We've seen this in the media. And so there's a number of foreign states, as one of my colleagues says, they're not necessarily all hostile to Canadian interests. Some of them are kind of, I guess you could say, neutral. Some of them could be allied. But it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hit and miss in some areas. And I don't want to go back to belaboring PRC, although that is the reason we're here. They just do it extremely well. They really do. It's a whole of government, whole society approach. You know about the national security law that was passed in 2017, where anyone with Chinese status anywhere in the world has to cooperate. But there are other players. It's just not the same depth.
In your opinion, if we're dealing with the Apex A-team in this, and we're providing legislative recommendations and frameworks from this committee in dealing with China as a case study, is it your opinion that we would then cover off all of them, or is the differences that you identified between the way in which different foreign actors operate, is that going to require a broader understanding of the different tactics and strategies used in order to safeguard our democracy?
Yeah, I think in the general macro sense, yes, we have to have these legislative tools. We have to have a capability of enforcement. We have to have some end games on that. And so you could use that template with other states. It's just the there's a deterrence effect as well when you have legislation. You can use that to sort of mitigate a bit of the threat. But they are different. Russians are different. Russians operate differently, and Iranians clearly operate differently. So I wouldn't want to suggest that we, have some sort of broad review of all the state actors and try to come up with some common approach on things. I think what we really should do is deal with what we're seized with right now, which of course is the PRC.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Green, we're going to go to Mr. Brock. Welcome to committee. Mr. Brock, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for your attendance and participation in this important study. I'd like to start off by saying hello to Mr. Chu, and have a number of questions for you, sir. So I understand that it wasn't just yourself that was impacted by foreign election interference, but in fact your former colleagues Alice Wong and Bob Soraya. Now, I've done a little bit of research. I understand that all three of those ridings have a very large Chinese-Canadian population. Can you opine as to what you believe to be one of the factors or a number of factors that contributed to the number of traditional conservative Canadians in those ridings that for whatever reason simply did not vote? I understand there was a substantial drop in the percentage of voting, not only in your riding, but Ms. Wong's and Mr. Soraya's. Can you offer some information on that for me, please?
Absolutely. I think there has been a study conducted that shows across Canada, wherever there is a high concentration of Chinese population ridings with that, the number of support that the Conservative in 2021 has received has dropped, bucking the trend of all the other ridings in the neighboring ridings where those ridings are. And I think this is the effect of the disinformation that's been spread. Yes, they target specific candidates such as myself, in ridings that I represent or I was running, but at the same time they would also generalize this and use it across Canada in many of the Chinese ridings to indicate that the party itself, the leadership itself, they have taken an anti-Chinese role, and the fact that they've misconstrued that Mr. O'Toole, the conservative, will ban WeChat. Consider, put yourself in their shoes. If you rely on WeChat for the only lifeline to connect to your family and conduct business in Canada, and if a political party will do that, and that particular party, there's an MP that proposed a foreign registry that would put you and your descendants into jeopardy. Would you be voting for that, even though they align very well with your value? So I believe across the country, it actually has hurt many of writing, even though we have won but potentially with a smaller margin.
I guess it really highlights the importance of social media to Chinese Canadians, particularly the platform of WeChat. Were there other platforms of social media or other ways that they spread the message that you ought not to be considering conservatives in the next election?
It's not just WeChat. It's not just social media. It's multidimensional. It's on the airwave that CRTC is supposed to be regulating. It's on printed media. It's also on websites. These multidimensional disinformation campaigns help to solidify the mistrust on certain particular politicians or political party, and it's very effective, especially during election time.
Was any of these issues prevalent in your election success in 2019? Did you feel the pressures from Beijing?
In 2015, I actually had an opportunity to sit down with the Consul General in Vancouver. I believe she was trying to size me up back then. But in 2019, they have decided that I'm completely beyond hope. So the information that I've got from my Chinese supporter has been that They've told people not to vote for me, but there is no active campaign against me that I can observe.
In 2019, NSICOP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which is made up of parliamentarians of every stripe, studied the whole issue of foreign election interference and made a number of recommendations that would appear that the Liberal government did not follow through on. Our Prime Minister most recently, in light of all of the information that has been leaking, has indicated that he has to do a better job and follow the recommendations. How does that make you feel, sir, knowing that the Prime Minister who had this information 4 years ago essentially ignored all of those recommendations?
Very quick response, please, Mr. Chu, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I try to be as nonpartisan as I can, but frankly, being a targeted person and a particular ethnic race, I feel I'm vulnerable. That my government is not there to protect me when it's needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Brock, Mr. Baines, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As candidates, we're all victims of misinformation and disinformation. When we're in an election and there were campaign against me that I was going to legalize hard drugs and things of that nature. But I want to go back to maybe Mr. Stanton, because the community I live in has Filipino, Indo-Canadian, Hong Kong, mainland China, strong Muslim Canadian community. We actually have a 5-kilometer corridor in the city. It's called the Highway to Heaven, and it's every religious institution, about 28 of them, all along this corridor. So it's a very, very mixed community that I've lived in my whole life. So it's important to me. I think we had a list of all the nations you were talking about, including USA, India, PRC, Iran, Russia. So, are there more than that we need to be mindful of? And I understand you've said that China is number one. They're the A team. But are there others that are maybe developing a little bit more? Because it's clear Canada is, as we've said for many years now, you're saying long-standing target. Everybody wants to trade. Everybody wants to get an advantage. So are there other nations that are emerging?
Well, yeah, I would say in terms of foreign interference as it's defined in the CSIS Act Section 2, no, there aren't a lot others. We have to also bear in mind foreign states do want to influence what goes on in Canada. That is part of normal diplomacy and engagement. And, you know, it's no surprise certain state would probably, with a particular diaspora community, want to have some engagement there. And the service is only looking at it when there's evidence of clandestine activity and things like that. So I would say probably on a positive note, no, and I wouldn't say a lot of those communities are targeted by, let's say, their foreign state equivalent in interfering in that. It's just a few principal ones. But bear in mind, CSIS doesn't look at elections, which you'll be happy to know. They're just looking at the target of a threat, the individual who may happen to run for office or who may happen to do that. So they don't have investigations where they're looking at communities and you know, the politics that goes on and things like that.
Did you want to add to?
Yes, I would like. Yes, I would
okay,
like to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
To complete a little bit Mr. Stanton's comment, there is other countries as well that has been identified. Radio-Canada in Montreal, for example, has found out that Rwanda had sent 3 agents in the community to monitor, intimidate, and report. We have Saudi Arabia, for example, sending people as well to do exactly the same of bullying in the community and being very aggressive in that perspective. Dan has mentioned also India, very, very, very active as well in the community, and that's been for decades in that perspective. We could go on like this as well. And there's also some friends. France, for example, has been doing it as well for since Vive le Québec Libre. So we've been subject of those kind of foreign interference for a long, long, long period of time. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools to investigate properly. Unfortunately, even the $50 million that will be given to the RCMP will be to do what? Simply take the complaint? Because we don't have anything to sort of put it against a law that will be capable to punish the people, because they're not only foreign states, they are also agents recruited by that are Canadians acting on behalf of those foreign states. That's where we lack very, very much.
The only thing that I'd add to what my colleagues have said is that we shouldn't only be looking backward at the actors that have in the past targeted our democratic institutions. We need to look how the threat to our democracy is evolving and how technology is going to, quite frankly, democratize the ability for hostile actors, state and non-state, to undermine confidence in our democracy and undermine the social cohesion that holds Canadians together.
Yeah, and that's why I was trying to find out the emerging other nations that are there, and that's why it's important for me to be here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baines. We've got about 35 minutes left. We're going to go to the next round and start with Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
I can take the full 35, Chair. Okay.
Any objection?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have several questions, noting that I only have 5 minutes. A few quick yes or no, if I could, from you, Mr. Junoketsu. Is it your belief that the current Prime Minister knew about foreign interference, not influence attempts in the 2019 and 2021 federal elections?
I wouldn't be able to say if Mr. Trudeau was informed. I can only go with the allegation that were demonstrated presented. Sorry.
Based on your, pardon me for interrupting. Based on your experience over the last 30 years, would it be your belief that he would have been briefed on it?
Yes.
Do you believe that sufficient action, or do you believe that sufficient action was taken in response to it by the government?
Nope.
Do you believe that, based on media reports and on your experience, that the current government benefited in any way from interference attempts in the 2019 or 2021 elections?
Potentially.
We know that the CCP undertook a campaign to gain influence with Mr. Trudeau through clandestine funding of his family foundation, the Trudeau Foundation. Do you believe that that campaign has been effective?
Yes.
Mr. Stanton, thank you, sir. Mr. Stanton, in June of 2017, it's been reported that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff requested a brief on foreign interference in Canadian politics, and that briefing said that there's a substantial. Are you familiar with this, sir?
Not really.
You're not familiar with the reporting of this?
No.
Any of the panelists familiar with the reporting of the 2017 request for a brief by Ms. Telford on foreign interference in elections? Okay. Moving on. How would the Prime Minister, based on your experience in the security apparatus, how would a Prime Minister or their staff be briefed on foreign interference issues by CSIS? Well, specifically, like who from CSIS typically, like what level of individual would deliver that briefing to a Prime Minister?
For who are you asking?
Anyone who has an answer.
I don't have an answer from my experience of what particular vehicles of briefing or personnel. I know that, CSIS provides a whole range of intelligence products, from assessment to raw. You'll be looking at the Privy Council office, you'll be looking at various departments.
Okay.
So how that would make its way to the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, I really have no insight.
Okay. Do you believe that the scientists, Mr. Stanton, are you familiar with the case of the Winnipeg lab?
Yeah.
And that there were, that on CSIS's information, 2 scientists were fired or removed from their employment there?
Yes, I'm aware, yeah.
Do you believe that they were CCP agents?
Not necessarily. Here's what I believe, based on the media reports. I've been following it. The service provided advice in terms of a clearance, whether it's a clearance renewal or whether it's a clearance, which goes to the deputy head of the department. And it's their decision what to do. It's not CSIS' decision. They simply say, we would recommend perhaps not a renewal. And I think these 2 individuals basically returned to mainland China.
So they're not still in. Your belief is that they're not still in Canada.
Well, from what I've read in the media, it looks like no one's around, and I think the fact no charges have been laid might reflect that. But I look at this and I see, okay, there was an issue there. Perhaps proprietary information was sent back to China. Who knows? It probably doesn't meet the threshold of espionage.
Okay. I just have about 30 seconds left.
Okay.
So in my previous round of questions, I talked about this issue of MI5 and the FBI making a public announcement with respect to that foreign agent acting in the UK. So those are 2 of our Five Eyes partners who are publicly communicating on issues of foreign influence and foreign interference. Yet it's radio silence, and then we're left to question whether or not we have CSIS agents who are leaking because we don't have anyone from CSIS who's actually speaking to the real issues that we all know for a fact are happening and being perpetrated on this country by state actors from around the world, including from Beijing. How do we fix that?
And here's my answer.
It's got to be real quick.
It'll be really quick. In those cases, those allied releases, it was probably based on very convincing intelligence, probably corroborated intelligence, so they did the release. All we're getting through the media, all due respect, is allegations. So why the Canadian government wouldn't make these warnings and send emails to everybody, it may be because there just wasn't meeting that threshold of solid, reliable intelligence that MPs need to be advised.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Wilczynski. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Martinez Ferrada. You have 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll share my 5 minutes with Mr. Fergus. I wanted to speak about Mr. Chu's electoral campaign. You said that there was interference in different WeChat groups. Here's a question for you. When looking at the results of the election, you saw that the Liberal and the NDP vote had greatly increased. Do you not believe also that voters simply wanted to vote for a progressive government? And maybe it was a reflection of the Conservative Party's position on LGBT communities or other political issues. Is it really interference? That's the reason of that.
Question. If you look into the election results in 2021, the fact that the number of voters turnout has actually dropped significantly. There is a 3,000 vote less in 2021 versus 2019. In as well, my supporters, the one who voted me in 22 months prior to the 2021 election in 2019, I have 4,400 fewer voters. My opponent, the one who actually took the writing, had increased the support by a mere 1,800 votes. That is a significant discrepancy. In other words, there are many conservative supporters who actually stay at home.
Et le vote du NPD, vous n'êtes pas d'accord aussi?
And what about the NDP vote? You're not in agreement also that the votes of the NDP also increased as well? One minute, please, Mr. Chu. Mr. Villemur.
On est dans le sujet.
It seems to me that this is Proc's topic. This is not the scope of our committee study. We're looking at interference in general.
We do give a little bit of latitude to members of Parliament to deal with their specific questions. I've stopped the clock. You have 2 minutes and 48 seconds, Madame Martinez-Ferretta.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais donner...
Thank you. I'll give the rest of my time to Mr. Fergus. Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Ferretta-Martinez. Mr. Stanton, your answer to my last question has really sparked my curiosity. I know you have had a long and distinguished career with CSIS, and you've said that a CSIS agent, in your opinion, is not at the origin of these leaks. Who do you think is behind those leaks? You said what it isn't, or who it isn't. Well, then who is it?
No idea. I don't know. I just really have no respect for this at all. I think there's an awful lot of damage that's being done. I could carry on from some things that Arthur has mentioned, but I have no respect for it. I do think the profile of the leaker, I can provide that. It's someone who's seeing a small piece. It's someone who's not privy to the big picture. They don't see all the work and all the effort that goes in to countering certain threats. And they're just seeing a little piece of the pie. And then on their own, I'd say somewhat arrogantly, decided that they have the prerogative to inflict this damage for whatever cause they may have. And I think some of this is being filtered a little bit embellished by the media to provide a certain nobility to it. And we may find when the dust settles, it's not such a big personality that did this. It may be someone who's just got a little slight, maybe didn't get enough attention. I really don't put a lot of respect in what this person or people are doing. And that's not the reason I'm saying, oh, it's not CSIS, because I worked in CSIS and we're all wonderful. But people in work in the business don't get mad and angry. They'll go take mindfulness or something if they do. They don't decide, oh, this is terrible. They're not responding to our reporting, and then they're going to go to the media. I really don't think so, because we're talking about professionals. The Canadian intelligence community is professionals. Not necessarily the person leaking it is involved in the collection or the assessment. They may just be seeing reports, and they want to use this for a certain agenda. They may even be manipulating the media as well, if I may say so, as far as the control of the whole thing. I'm convinced it's someone that's not in the service. As far as speculation, Ottawa's a big town, and there's a lot of paper that was circulating. Well, I imagine right now there's probably not a lot of paper being circulated and shared. but it's anybody's guess. But I think it's somebody who's got an agenda.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I think they want it. Yeah, that's enough. Yeah.
Okay, I'll see, Monsieur.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Vilmore, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Mr. Juno Katsuya, you've drawn the portrait, and I want to ask you, what would be the risk if we would not put together this independent investigative office? Answer, it would be extremely damageable to national security. If I may use an analogy that may make you laugh a bit, let's say you're dropping crumbs in your kitchen and you have ants approaching. 2 or 3 ants, not an issue. If you don't pick up the crumbs, if you don't tidy up, then you're going to have an infestation of ants. And if you wait too long, then you'll need the pest control specialists. Same thing here applies here. As Mr. Stanton mentioned, the scope of Chinese intelligence is huge. It is probably the most formidable opponent in the history of humanity. Why? Because they have such means. Also, they work very subtly. And finally, there's also the scope of their foreign interference operation, but they're far from being the only group working thus. As we've said, many countries are doing the same. There's a huge difference between influencing and interfering, and we need to be aware of that difference, of that nuance, so that we can actually act against interference. Thank you very much. Following my colleague across this question, do you believe that these leaks are coming from CSIS? Answer, I couldn't say for sure. I do agree with Mr. Stanton that the information could have been gleaned upon by somebody in the bigger community of intelligence. It's hard to know, it's hard to pinpoint. Would you like to add something? Yes, I would like to react to your question to my colleague, Mr. Juno Katsuya, regarding the creation of a new organization. I believe there would be risks if we were to create a new institution to manage interference. We need to recognize that we have independent police forces, we have CSIS that have their act that governs their action. And when we create something new with new mandates, the risk that we run is that our objectives will be harder to achieve as opposed to just giving better directions to the institutions that already exist, like CSIS and the RCMP. That's interesting because we've heard that for the last 30 years doing this has not worked. Answer, yes, absolutely. There are challenges in the way the issue is being managed now, fair. But that doesn't mean that we need to throw out the model of an independent intelligence service that has governing acts and laws that tell them how to act. I think that as parliamentarians, there's a way for you to give better directions, clear directions to the intelligence community with clearer thresholds for investigation so that we can really, truly address the problem. I've had, as a public servant of 30 years, I see there's always an issue when we create new institutions. Thank you.
A little more than 2.5 minutes. There's a little bit of latitude there on that time, so I'll give you about 3 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Mr. Juno Katsuya, you had mentioned, you raised the issue, I think, around nomination processes. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how foreign interference can happen at the first start of an electoral process, which is the nomination process.
Well, basically, what we know and what we realize is that we have foreign agent, and even diplomats engage into foreign intelligence activities that are capable to identify and maybe even to farm out individuals that will be capable to simply position themselves. The concept of infiltrating a mole into either an intelligence service or a government is very, very old. We've been doing that
more specifically and more succinctly, just on the process. I think you talked about having citizens versus non-citizens voting in nominations. What's been your experience of nomination processes being directed or guided or influenced by foreign actors through pressure to vote for certain candidates over others?
Well, it's the concept. There's many different operations that has been done. It's the concept of having agent of influence capable to sort of guide or misguide certain individuals. Back in 1995, for example, I was working on a specific file, a Sidewinder, and I discovered in Election Canada that the Embassy of China was giving that year money to the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party at the same time because they were going to nourish influence within those political parties. Back in the mid-90s, the Chinese government were very clumsy in the way to do it. They became very, very much more sophisticated, and they have increased the amplitude of their operations to a size that is difficult to capture now, even by our active intelligence services. So,
Mr. Stan, if I only got 10 seconds left. Mr. Stan, have you been ever aware of foreign actors? I know in Ontario there were allegations around Patrick Brown using foreign nationals during the nomination processes. Is that something that's ever been flagged across your desk?
No, I mean, I've been retired from the service for a few years, but no, again, it goes back to, CSIS doesn't look at elections. They don't look at processes. So in the course of investigating an individual target, no, I'm not aware of that coming across the radar, and issues that the service would get involved with as to who's voting at a nomination or who's donating, what status do they have. They wouldn't. This is politically explosive issue, but from a threat perspective, in a way, it's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's not really, how should I put it? Well, it's not a priority to get in and investigate it in that type of detail. And so, again, they're focused on the target, not what's going on in elections.
Got you.
Thank you, Mr. Stan.
Thank you.
Mr. Green. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Kirk for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayerthorpe, the Winnipeg Labs issue, it's been asked to a number of the other candidates, but specifically I'd like to ask for if you could, in about a minute or a minute and a half, talk about some of the concerns that have been highlighted about that and how that, because of what was an election call, that issue just kind of disappeared after the last election. And then some of the other techniques that the communist dictatorship in Beijing uses to influence university campuses and whatnot. I'm wondering if in about a minute or minute and a half, if you could maybe expand on some of that, Mr. Mayerthorpe.
Yeah, I don't have any direct information about the Winnipeg situation, but it does fit into a pattern which goes back to really it actually goes back to the 1940s and 50s, but particularly after diplomatic recognition in 1970, when very soon afterwards there were arrangements made for exchange of students and of researchers. What is very noticeable is that the Canadians who went to China went to study language and culture, and the Chinese who came here gravitated towards the technical faculties of universities and institutions, and that has carried on. And of course, as we know, it has also involved more lately Chinese or Communist Party associated institutions financing research here, using our expertise to their own ends, and often the patents that have resulted from that research go to the People's Republic of China. They have not stayed here. So it's a very broad effort here in our technical institutions, and also, of course, it has been accompanied by a very large influx of Chinese undergraduate students, and with the result that a lot of the revenue of some of our universities, in some universities, more than half the tutorial revenue comes from foreign students, and in some cases, most of that comes from China. So it's been a very, very persistent and lengthy effort to use our universities to their own ends.
Okay, Thank you very much, Mr. Mayerthorpe. Mr. Stanton, my colleague Mr. Barrett had mentioned, were you still at CSIS in 2017?
It's the year I left.
That's the year. Oh, yeah. Okay.
But I might have been 2017, October 2017.
Okay. So, Mr. Barrett had mentioned a 2017 briefing that had mentioned that there was a substantial body of evidence that the CCP and their officials were pursuing a strategy to influence Canadian officials. Are you aware of what that body of evidence may be or what it would include?
I was working in a field office. I really don't know. I have no idea.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Mr. Chu, I wanted to, in about the minute or minute and a half that I've left, we've heard about the bill that you tabled about the Foreign Influence Registry. I'm wondering if you could, in 60 seconds or so, just expand a little bit about why you believe that would be an important tool to help restore some of the trust that Canadians need in their democratic institutions.
It will be consistent with what CSIS have been advising the leadership of our country, that sunshine is the best disinfectant. With openness and transparency is the best way to deal with foreign interference issues and also regain many of the lost trust of Canadians to the institution. Also remove, the political partisanship from all the issues. This information is used when it's most effective, when it's in the shadow, it's under the table, but also at the same time, by repeating itself, it's becoming more and more effective. And so by having a registry, allowing our society, the investigative journalist, to be able to look at that. For example, through my research, I was able to find that the Liberal Party of Canada had an entry in the United States FARA, the Foreign Agent Registry entry in 2019, fundraising among the Canadian diaspora there. So transparency like that would help definitely protect our institutions' confidence.
Thank you. Mr. Chu. Next, I have Mr. Baines for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be sharing some of my time with Mr. Fergus here. Mr. Stanton, I'm going to go back to you just on this topic of the registry. One of the criticisms of the foreign agent registries, and several countries have had them, is that, and you've mentioned, I think that, there's the new tactic is the proxies have eclipsed traditional spies. So how do we address, so if foreign agents are using proxies to conduct their work,
right?
How can we enforce the legislation, or how do you broadly put the net on these Canadian proxies?
Well, here's the thing. The Security of Information Act is where we're going to get that enforcement. We're going to get that there's an actual legislated regulator you could use. The registry, and I know there's a lot of people who want the registry, and I think it has merits. But I don't think it should necessarily be the priority towards the legislation. People that are going to put their name on the registry are people that are representing some foreign agency, whether it's a Canadian diplomat overseas, whether it's business, whether it's whatever, ideally so they're not going to get a fine. There are clandestine actors. You want to link them to the United Front Work Department, they are not going to be putting their name on a registry. There's no box to tick. Exactly. So a lot of the most damaging foreign interference activity is clandestine. So what it's really going to do, and I think a registry is good, is it's going to allow the government to have some control over lobbying and sort of kind of rein it in a little bit, where I would have to identify if I am representing a foreign country. But is it going to really blunt PRC foreign interference in our democratic institutions? In my opinion, it's not.
Thank you.
Quick questions, and I know that the risk doing this, so I'm going to ask them both at the same time, and I hope that we can get the answers. They're very different questions. Monsieur Junot Ketsua, everyone here has acknowledged that this issue has been going on for decades. When we formed government, we created NCCOP and CIRA, the Site Task Force, the Election Protocol and Rapid Response Mechanism, and the list goes on. Why do you think that these kind of tools were not developed by previous governments, although we all recognize that this was a long-standing problem. The second question, which I would ask, is probably to Mr. Wilczynski again. You had mentioned the importance of having diversity as part of the security establishment. It seems that we are always running behind because we don't have direct connections into the communities, diasporic communities who are subject to intimidation and pressure. What can we be doing, and are you aware of your former colleagues who are now in place seeking to deal with that issue?
Very, very quickly, I think it's a problem of culture. For too long, and it was mentioned by my colleagues during their for too long, the Canadian governments have not developed the culture of security, have not developed the culture of warning the general population or warning elected officials of the temptations, of the danger that they will be facing. If you have access to power, you become a target. You are somebody who might be sort of approached and used intentionally or not intentionally, consciously or unconsciously. You will be used. Let's remember one thing. The Chinese wrote the book 2,000 years ago, The Art of War, read Sun Tzu, it's right there, the how to use influence. They know exactly, and they're really, 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 really good at it. They became even better. So we have to develop a new culture.
So very quickly,
Morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion.
Welcome to meeting number 63 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore, members can attend in person in the room and remotely.
That's the only difference that I have from the NDP on this particular concurrence motion. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Question comment. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank our honourable colleague. You know, he is a good soldier. He goes on and on and on, and he quotes lots of things. Well, I'd like to quote something from the media. It's breaking news, and perhaps he'd like to check his phone about breaking news right now of a Liberal MP that secretly advised a Chinese diplomat in 2021 to delay the freeing of the two Michaels. I would like to ask this honourable colleague for a comment onto that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, I'm sitting here, Mr. Speaker. I've been speaking for the last 15 minutes, not including interruptions. I'm unaware of the breaking news that this member is referencing. I'm looking forward to look into it. But we see, once again here, Mr. Speaker, the exact same rhetoric that comes from Conservatives, the exact same thing that the member from Red Deer Lacombe was trying to do when he, walking through an airport, looking like the hero on his way back to Ottawa, was saying, I'm on my way to Ottawa to fight for you and deal with the agents of Beijing. Come on. That's not what this place is supposed to be about, Mr. Speaker. The rhetoric that comes from Conservatives, including that last question, is intentionally trying to mislead Canadians, and I find it extremely unfortunate.
Questions and comments.
Assassination.
With that, we'll go to our 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. de Boer, but I might actually ask all three witnesses to comment on the question. I want to talk about the threat of what I guess I would think of as sort of corporate espionage or the vulnerabilities within the private sector to cybersecurity. There was an article recently that talked about how hackers can manipulate the temperature of a barn and wipe out livestock populations, or that the food chain and the food supply chain in Canada is particularly vulnerable to cyber attack. But so that goes well beyond, though, just the damage to a private corporation. This goes right to food security, things like that. So I'll maybe start with you and have each witness comment on the vulnerabilities within the private sector that affect national security.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. An excellent organization. You know, the focus of cybersecurity up until now has been largely on what we call enterprise, right? IT systems. But one of the largest gaps that has emerged is a focus on operational technology. These are typically systems that control, for instance, electric grid, gas power turbines, industrial control systems and pipelines, etc. And a lot of these systems are now coming online. What we've witnessed in the U.S., for instance, related to the Colonial Pipeline attack, or even in Florida to the Oldsmar water system. These systems were not designed to be connected to the internet, and now, including farm equipment, etc., are now trying to enable optimization through connection to the internet. We noted, for instance, in the manufacturing sector over the past year, the number of attacks have risen by 2,000%. And, you know, the three sectors most targeted over the past year by cyber criminals has been healthcare, financial, and manufacturing. But manufacturing is rising the quickest. And why? Our assessment is that because of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we're seeing, because of the intrinsic link between economic security and national security, and the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, everything is intertwined, those are becoming increasing attack vectors.
I'll ask the other witnesses to comment as
Absolutely.
well, and maybe have time for other questions. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Mr. Nared?
Yes, thank you for your question. Let me say that cybercrime, right, consists, that is the term that we usually use to describe both industrial espionage and ordinary crime activities, is in fact the third largest economy in the world. Like by 2025, the damages resulting from cybercrime are going to amount to $15 trillion, right? And they grow by an amount of $1,500 billion a year. It is a huge problem, and the efforts from, let's say, the efforts conducted in this manner are not in pair with damages that are occurring and that they are growing. So taking it into account what the previous witness was talking about, that is attacks on critical infrastructure especially, which are in fact forbidden by a Geneva Convention because it's actually attacking civilian infrastructure, is growing daily. And we have to take state nation actors into account, especially Russia. This is what I was trying to enforce before, right? The Vulcan files. Before we were just speculating on their capabilities, but now we are certain and we have confirmation that they are collecting data all over the world. They are compromising systems, power plants, hydroelectric power plants, electric grids, civilian infrastructure from hospitals to everything else, collecting that, scanning systematically, collecting vulnerabilities in one huge giant database and preparing in a way for a black swan scenario. So what I'm really concerned about is that Western countries, NATO countries, are not protecting their infrastructure in the manner that they should be. It is a huge problem and it should be addressed promptly.
Thanks for the question. And just very briefly, it's clear that there's a role for the federal government in supporting private companies in increasing their cybersecurity and protecting national security. We think that one of the things that's key to this is that there's trust and transparency around that process so that private companies can trust what the government is going to be doing when they provide that support. And also among the public that there's trust and understanding around what those services are. And so we think that that needs to be a central component of legislation like C-26.
Not even just a quick moment. I want to ask something quite specific resulting from Mr. Nared's testimony there.
But you're right on, bang on 6 minutes. And if I do, the trouble is the whole thing just goes south on me if I let one away. So I'm sorry, Pat. Yes.
Quantify that trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar number.
It is a shocking number, and I picked up on it as well. But Mr. May, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. DeBoer, to Mr. DeBoer, you noted in a 2021 post for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that, quote, the OECD reports that Canada is one of the few countries where technology R&D investment is stagnant, investing only 1.5% of GDP and declining, while Canada's competitors are investing billions to improve their cybersecurity capabilities. In your opinion, sir, what are some of the factors that contribute to that underinvestment in R&D by the Canadian private sector?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Indeed, Canada, actually, that was in 2021, but the data remains the same today. We are laggards when it comes to R&D investment. Some of the key factors related to that, while we welcome, for instance, the renewal and revision of the SHRED announced very recently, enterprises benefit much more from developing R&D outside of Canada, particularly multinational corporations, because there are much more collaborative support systems in place, whether it be with university-based research or elsewhere. Now, BlackBerry has made a commitment to invest in Canada. We invest about 24% of our annual revenue in R&D, working very closely with Canadian universities, et cetera. But not all companies are incentivized to do so. And so there really needs to be a concerted partnership between government and private sector, not across all the board, but betting in particular niche areas where Canada has a comparative advantage. And our post here was that cybersecurity is one of the areas where Canada has a comparative advantage. We rank 4th in the world in the number of cybersecurity companies, but we're not keeping up to pace with Israel, the UK, or the US, which is far ahead of us. Thank you.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more and provide some recommendations on how can we take steps to ensure that IP grown in Canada, often with the help of direct or indirect public funding, stays in Canada?
So I think one of the key things here is commercialization. There's a lot of what we call lower TRL, or very initial stage R&D that takes place in Canada. But then after it passes this initial stage, it goes through something called the Valley of Death, which means it's very difficult to productize this R&D here in Canada. And there are very few programs, for instance, that support Canadian companies to help maybe launch initial products, to test them, to get them to market. While in the United States, for example, of course, U.S. government procurement budgets are much larger, but their procurement process is much more agile. They have systems in place to help that companies get through that valley of death, to help commercialize their products. And so, in terms of some of the suggestions we put forward with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, was to establish a Canadian commercialization fund that would help Canadian companies move towards that productization. The Canadian Innovation Agency, which was announced in the 2022 budget, maybe a start, but we yet have very much details about that. So we're hopeful that the whole commercialization question there, right, which will help commercialize products here in Canada, keep IP in Canada, would be a key aspect to that question.
We've heard a number of times there are concerns that electronic components manufactured by state-affiliated corporations in countries like China pose a cybersecurity risk in Canada. Should we be concerned about the cybersecurity risk posed by offshore manufacturing of IT equipment?
BlackBerry, since it created devices, was very focused on ensuring that all of the components in those devices, including software, were what they said they were. We even developed software that helped us identify the provenance of each component. This is a huge concern. I mean, in the U.S., you have Executive Order 14028, which is about the nation's cybersecurity, which actually mandate what they call a software bill of materials, which would basically produce an ingredients list of all software contained in every device. Right now, if you ask people what software is in their system or in their device, very few people know about it. Part of the problem is also open source software, right? This is free software available on the internet that is used widely, but where there are high security vulnerabilities. So I think one thing that Canada should consider, that many other countries in the EU and the US are considering, is making sure that there's a commitment to secure by design principles. You can't bolt on security afterwards.
Thank you. In my last 10 seconds, sir, I'm wondering if it's the will of the committee, if Mr. Nared talked about information that he can't share in this forum. I'm wondering if I could request that he work with the clerk to find a potential solution for that.
I don't see why that's not a good idea. We'll leave it as an instruction. Thank you for that. With that, Madame Normandin, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to continue with you, Mr. de Boer, in your line of questioning from Mr. May. In your 3 priorities, you mentioned the importance of being well equipped to be able to act in a preventative rather than a reactive manner, and it would strike me that Canada is often reactive. As far as equipment and materials are concerned, could you please pinpoint what kind of priority investments there should be, AI-driven ones, cryptographics and mapping? What would be the top priority as far as equipment is in order to be in a preventative mode? Thank you for the question.
What we can do immediately is to ensure that Department of National Defense, that our government, that our critical infrastructure are equipped with what we call the latest technologies. That is not the case right now. AI-driven technologies. Right now, there's 2 large problems. One, there are not enough cyber professionals in the world. There are more than 3 million vacant jobs globally. In Canada, probably around 200,000. And the Department of National Defense and these critical infrastructure agencies suffer with that as well. So you have to complement that with machines, right, with AI, because there's more than 400,000 new malware samples a day. So this is proven technology. BlackBerries, for instance, was developed in 2012. We're in our 7th generation. So that can be implemented. Ensure that in the procurement speculations, et cetera, that we are not including specs that tie us to previous generations of technology, signature-based. That's one. Number 2, we have to continually invest in R&D, as was mentioned previously, to ensure that we outpace our rivals. We're already seeing cyber criminals use ChatGPT and others for phishing attacks, right? We need to ensure that our AI is better than their AI when it comes to defending. So that's something that we can do immediately. Quantum cryptography, those technologies exist, but some of those issues we need to continually work on. But that is an endeavor that's ongoing. But I would suggest, let's use the technology we have now. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. You also spoke about the collaboration between the private and public sectors. I'd like to hear your input about that, and also, Mr. Nared, about tripartite cooperation with ethical hackers. Is that possible? Mr. De Boer first, and then Mr. Nared, please.
C'est une très bonne question.
That's an excellent question.
The reality right now is that a lot of public-private partnership or collaboration in Canada is, again, reactive. It's in the wake of an incident, right, or an indicator of vulnerability, and it's largely one way. We provide information to the government, disappears into a black hole. BlackBerry maintains good relationships with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, et cetera, but that could be much more robust. What I would suggest, again, moving to a prevention-first approach, is let's plan before an incident. Let's develop, operational plans, contingency plans, mitigation plans, in terms that clarify roles and responsibilities when a critical infrastructure system is hacked, right? And in terms of working with hackers, absolutely, we work with white hackers, ethical hackers, right, to test vulnerabilities in systems, whether that be in automobiles or in other connected devices. They're a key part of our community. Not so sure about in Canada, but in some contexts, their ability to work in cohort and in collaboration with businesses and government is limited because there's the legal framework to enable that is not allowed. In the UK, for instance, they're currently considering changing that legal framework. So there could be much more robust collaboration between white hackers, the good hackers, and government, etc. But it's a fantastic question. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Nadir.
Mr. Nadir, or would you like to tack on to that, please? Nared, rather, sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think that collaboration with ethical hackers is crucial if we want to secure the Western nations. And for example, I would put a pilot, Pentagon's pilot bug bounty program as an example, where they open up their systems on a bug bounty platform where ethical hackers could go test their systems and report their vulnerabilities. The result was that the systems got compromised. The first report came in, I believe, in first 7 minutes, and in first 6 hours there were like 200 to 300 reports. So that means 300 security vulnerabilities, 300 security holes that an adversary could exploit to gain access to their systems. And because of this collaboration, the Pentagon was more secured. And I believe that it was Mr. Ash Carter that complemented the effort, the initiative, and in a way concluded that they didn't realize how many good ethical hackers, how many good IT professionals there are that would like to help, but they don't have the opportunity to do so. And as the experience in Ukraine has shown, using crowdsourced intelligence, using crowdsourced efforts is the key in such environment, especially in cyber environment, to achieve desired results. Without it, I don't think it's even possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Normandine. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. McSorley, I wanted to ask you, in this committee, we specifically have heard from, at the beginning actually of the study, we heard from Canadian Intelligence Agency, CSE specifically, and they specifically said repeatedly that Canadian intelligence agencies don't target Canadians or collect data on Canadian activity, but that the BC Civil Liberties Association had a lawsuit And one of their concluding arguments was, and I quote, "What was truly shocking is how hard CSE pushes up against the edge of legality and pushes back against even the most reasonable regulation and oversight." So could you comment on that in terms of how those intelligence agencies are constantly pushing against the legal boundaries that are Canadian law?
Thank you very much for the question. I think a lot is riding on that word target in what you were speaking about in terms of what the CSE presented to the committee. So it's true that the CSE, through its mandate and through the CSE Act, cannot target Canadians. But in collecting signals intelligence and in carrying out their work, including on cyber security and protecting cyber infrastructure, as I mentioned, they collect all kinds of information and then they sift through it. And so there's information that's known as unselected information. And so that is information that is not specifically the target, but they may accumulate in carrying out their collections, and then that information is retained. And some of that information may relate to Canadians. And that's where they came into problems, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of sharing Canadian information with the Five Eyes and with other countries. It isn't that they are targeting Canadians, there's that word targeting, but rather that they are incidentally collecting that information, but they still retain it, and it is still used in other ways. And so that's what we see when they're pushing up against the boundaries. That's what they do. There's another category of information of metadata. So metadata isn't the communications itself, it's all the information around the communication. So who sent the information, who received it, what time, from where, what kind of software was used, what kind of equipment. And there's a debate that's longstanding around whether or not metadata should be considered private information. But it's been clear that metadata taken together can paint a very clear picture of what individuals do and can lead to being able to identify certain individuals. And yet the CSE has consistently argued that that doesn't amount to private information. And so we have questions around, again, it's not targeting of Canadians, but collecting that kind of information. And the final thing I'll mention is around publicly available information. So despite every other restriction around the CSE's collection of information, they are allowed to collect publicly available information. And again, they're not allowed to collect information that has privacy impacts on Canadians. But there's still debate around what's considered private information or what maintains a reasonable expectation of privacy. So for example, information that we post on social media, there's an argument that that's publicly available information. It's an argument that has been made. But at the same time, are we expecting that to be collected and retained and possibly shared by our national security agencies? That was at the heart of the debate around Clearview AI, where they argued that facial images of Canadians online were considered publicly available information and they could collect it. The Privacy Commissioner ruled that that was mass surveillance and was illegal. When they brought that to the RCMP said they had no obligation to ensure that if they were working with Clearview AI, that they were following Canadian law. We don't know about the CSE's work on facial recognition technology, but if we can see that with the RCMP and that approach and that definition and the lack of clarity around publicly available information, we have to be worried that the CSE would be interpreting it the same way.
Thank you for that. Yes, it was mentioned. Sorry, there's a lot of. There was mention within that same lawsuit in the documents that the BC Civil Liberties Association came out with that glossary of terms, that identification of unselective data, publicly available data and how it's used. Do laws like C-59, because that lawsuit that was before C-59, it was addressing more of the old Bill C-51 problems. But does Bill C-59, and I wanted to ask specifically again, as we look at Bill C-26, do those laws adequately address the threats that civil liberties are worried about in terms of that taking advantage of publicly available data?
That's a good question. You've got about 30 seconds to answer it. So
I'll just quickly say no. Several of the problems I raised were actually enshrined in Bill C-59, the creation of the CSE Act. And one of the things we think that needs to be done is to bolster the powers of both NSIRA and the Intelligence Commissioner to be able to review these kinds of activities and be able to discuss publicly their findings.
Okay, thank you. You actually was very efficient on your response. You'll get another 15 seconds, Ms. Matson. We're on the 5-minute round now, and Ms. Gallant.
Mr. Chairman, and my questions will be for Mr. Nared. I'm going to ask 3 quick questions, and then he can budget his time in answering them. Now, we just finished a study on the Arctic in this committee, and one of the recommendations, instead of getting submarines, is using drones under the ice in our Arctic. And we know that adversaries are currently transversing in submarines, and they have the data in real time. My question is there a vulnerability for a drone to underwater ice drone in the Arctic in transmitting the data back to whomever, as opposed to just being there in real time and seeing for yourself? So that's one, threats for under ice drones. 2 is, how is artificial intelligence impacting the cyber threat environment? And 3, how can security agencies or defense distinguish between a series of or simultaneous attacks on communications technology or industrial control systems? How can they tell if it is the precursor to a kinetic attack?
Mr. Nared?
Thank you, Ms. Gallant, for the questions. They're excellent ones. Regarding the drones, it's about the pinnacle of cybersecurity industry. That means it's about electronic warfare. And I've recently had discussions with people really tightly involved with the field, and it's an ongoing game of cat and mouse. It is not an answer that it's not a question that's easily answered, but there are technologies, but they are built more in the private sector, where there are drones available that are quite electronic warfare resistant. And we had an opportunity to see some of them flying over Russian territory recently, and they continue to fly. It is more of an electronic warfare question, but the main point here is that all those units, electronic warfare units, are able to pass the signal, right? But they have the most crucial problem is how to transform that signal to zeros and ones, to put it plainly. And that's one of the biggest challenges that electronic warfare units of Five Eyes countries or NATO countries are currently experiencing, but they are working on that. Now, regarding how AI is impacting cyber threat environment, I would say that it is a double-edged sword, right? It can be used both for defensive and offensive means, as our co-witness has previously stated. ChatGPT, for example, and I hate to put it as an example, has become one of the largest producers of malware. I mean, it got hacked in less than a few days. And black hat hackers use it efficiently, not just to produce phishing emails and content related to that, but you can effectively use it to produce very sophisticated malware. It is very easy to bypass the restrictions put in place by OpenAI and basically make it do to write whatever code that someone would think of, including to attack SCADA systems, including to, let's say, duplicate Stuxnet worm, or however. It all depends just on the creativity of the person talking with it. Now, how to distinguish, let's say, precursory attacks towards something that would lead to kinetic attacks? I would say that every precursory attack is something that will lead to kinetic attack, especially in terms of Russia and their capabilities. I would again like to point out just yesterday released information regarding the Vulcan files, which are very descriptive in terms of Russian cyber capabilities, and they actually prove that they have been systemically attacking Western infrastructure for years, attacking our infrastructure, attacking our industrial control systems, hospitals, and whatever information they can gather, they do gather, put in the database, and they simply wait for the right moment to strike. It is, as I've said, a black swan in the making, and we should start taking it very, very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Nared. Mr. Gallant. Mr. Souza, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your presentation. So we have a concern, all of us do, in regards to the security measures in this country, as well as then the privacy and our sovereignty as a nation. And my first question is to Mr. De Boer. When we look at the notion of IP and the commercialization of IP, the ownership, frankly, of the technologies that Canada seems to do well at advancing. In fact, Canada is a pretty good supplier of infrastructure and IT to other countries, and they themselves have noted we're lagging behind just by what they see happening in other jurisdictions. And I believe the Science and Research Committee are also looking at the commercialization of IP and how to get through that valley of death that you mentioned. The question then becomes who adjudicates some of these deals, and how do we coordinate the private sector to facilitate that engagement with the academic sector? And then what role does government have to play in this? And you mentioned a couple of funds that were being proposed. So I'm still struggling, though, that the mindset that we have, and while it may seem reactive, it's also a means of necessity by which to come forward with new technology, new innovation, and then protect it with ownership of the IP and the patent so that others can't use it. How do you make others accountable to, and other countries for that matter, accountable for escalating some of this, right? Is there a real sense of, I mean, the Five Eyes are out there, but there are misbehaviors. How do you make them accountable?
So it's a complex question, obviously. A lot of it outside of my scope of expertise. But when it comes to protecting against, for instance, espionage, malicious behavior, right, that tries to either siphon off or sabotage IP and the entire R&D process, there are a couple of vulnerabilities I think that need to be filled immediately. One, companies like BlackBerry, but not just BlackBerry, work very closely with universities, research institutes, small, medium-sized businesses in Canada to create new products, new IP. Across that chain, that supply chain, the security assurances required are not always in place, right? We need to ensure that security is as important, guarding that IP as we develop it is as important as developing it itself. In essence, it should be considered to be a national asset. And so when it comes to universities, I do know that CSIS has done is starting to push forward programs to raise the awareness about security within university research labs themselves to safeguard IP. We need to do similarly with SMEs that work on that. And so if there's one recommendation I could make, I mean, the Insurance Bureau of Canada did a survey last year asking SMEs about whether they had invested in cybersecurity. 47% of them had invested $0 last year in cybersecurity. And we know that SMEs are critical to IP creation. We need to do something to incentivize these SMEs to protect their IP. And they're not investing in it largely, apparently, because of the cost, right? It's a trade-off. And so I think, as a government, as a society, we need to shift the lens to start incentivizing security to be part of that. And the last thing I'll mention is, I said 2 years ago, wrote out a fantastic program in theory called the Canadian Digital Adoption Plan. The idea there was to increase the use of digital technologies by small, medium-sized businesses. Cybersecurity was not included in that initially. We worked with ISED later to include that in the assessment. But these kinds of programs need to embed cyber as a fundamental core of their operations.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa. You have 8 seconds left, and you're not going to get them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes.
Merci. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question of Mr. McSorley now. You spoke about a number of situations, including the CST, the protection of privacy and personal information. I don't know anything about this. How do you get that information about CSE activities, Wi-Fi, monitoring of connections in airports? Is that made public by the CSE, Communication Security Establishment, or how do you go about collecting that information? Thank you very much for the excellent question.
There's multiple ways that we collect that kind of information. So some of it is before the creation of the Intelligence Commissioner, there was the CSE Commissioner who initiated reviews. So it's the independent review and oversight bodies that often have access to this information and will share that information although still redacted in a way that protects national security when there are concerns. Sometimes those are even still difficult to interpret because of redactions and kind of euphemisms and language. Often it relies on access to information requests. Researchers, a lot of academic researchers and our own research, requesting documents, digging in and trying to find information. In terms of the issue around Wi-Fi at the airports, that was based on both the commissioner and also journalists who discovered the information and publicized it. Yeah. And then, one of the things that I based my...
excuse me, Charles, can you turn off your microphone, please? I think it's you anyways. Okay, continue.
Thank you. And one of the reasons that I have access to information that I have today is because of the BC Civil Liberties Association's lawsuit that resulted in disclosure that they then had to fight to be able to share the information that they obtained publicly and only recently were able to publish that publicly. And I guess what ties that all together is that the information isn't coming from the CSC itself. It's coming from external bodies, from researchers, from review committees, and from lawsuits. And it shouldn't have to be that way.
And on that point, you talked about the importance of accountability and transparency. Do you have any recommendations to make to have enhanced accountability and transparency?
One of the things that we've seen is that both in terms of the Intelligence Commissioner and in CIRA, that they're not receiving the information they require in order to do their review work. And in the case of the Intelligence Commissioner, their oversight work. So we think that there needs to be amendments made to the CSC Act that make authorizations for their various activities contingent on providing adequate and appropriate information to the Intelligence Commissioner, as well as providing the Intelligence Commissioner with the power to make binding amendments to the authorizations that the CSC is seeking.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. It seems like every time we get into your recommendations, I have to cut you off. So I'm sure we'll get it out by the course of the hour. Ms. Matheson, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
Fancy. So with that extra 15 seconds, I'll just say to Mr. McSorley, for all of those recommendations, I hope that you please do submit them to the clerk so that we can have that as part of our record and part of our study. I wanted to ask, within this committee, a lot of witnesses have talked about intelligence silos and Canadian intelligence agencies needing to integrate more for better intelligence sharing. but there are concerns when you get into, for example, CRA sharing with CSIS or sharing with CSE, that we have seen discrimination play a role in investigations of Muslim charitable organizations, for example. Mr. McSorley, could you speak to the dangers that are posed by that further integration and what we can do to avoid taking it too far in terms of that discrimination and victimization of some organizations that are quite legitimate?
Thank you very much for that question. So first, it's clear, as you said, that there is need for collaboration between national security agencies, and some of that does require the sharing of information. However, as you pointed out, what we have seen is that there are deep concerns around how some of that information is shared and what its impact can have. So for example, again, in the BC Civil Liberties Association's research, they found that the CSC was sharing evidence with, not evidence, but intelligence with the CRA regarding in order to bolster their efforts to counter terrorist financing. However, what we have found in our research is that the CRA, through their efforts to counter terrorist financing, has taken a prejudiced approach to Muslim charities in Canada and has been operating from an idea that because there are terrorist threats from Muslim-linked organizations, that the Muslim community must be placed under greater suspicion. And that results in greater surveillance, greater information gathering and sharing, and greater repercussions as compared to other communities in Canada. How this ties back to the study at hand is that the information, the intelligence that is shared isn't known publicly to the organization that's being used against, so they don't have the opportunity to challenge that. And we see that also reflected in, for example, C26, where there's, we believe, an undue amount of secrecy and ability to use information and to hide information from critical infrastructure companies that are providing telecommunication services to Canadians if they were to, for example, attempt to appeal or challenge an order made by the minister.
Okay,
and so,
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. McSorley, again. Madame Nyman, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you and good morning. I'd like to pose my questions to Mr. Nared this morning. A briefing document your organization provided to a previous House committee indicated that concerns raised by other observers were still valid. In fact, the organization specifically pointed to an article written by Alexander Rudolph, who appeared before this committee earlier this year. And in that, he said, Canada needs both a whole of government cybersecurity response and a very targeted cyber defense response. In addition to that, in a document provided to committee last year, it's quoted that the author wishes to reiterate that the CAF is not ready to meet even moderate cyber threats, such as hacktivists, and taking into account publicly available information and emerging threats, it won't be ready to meet modern cyber challenges for the foreseeable time. Could you possibly expand on that, and do you still share this view? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I still share that view because I think that I have. It's been a year since that document, but I believe that I wrote that the basic problem is that the threat environment was specified solely to where the Canadian Armed Forces are stationed, right at home in Canada and abroad. And that is a failure in understanding the cybersecurity environment in general. There is no defense perimeter anymore, right? Not just Canadian Armed Forces and their members, but also their family members are a target for a moderate attacker. A black hat hacker, or especially some sort of let's say a Russian group as a sandworm, they will not attack specifically hard and secure targets, but they will go after so-called low-hanging fruits first. That means even attacking family members, for example, compromising their home networks and expanding from that point onwards. We had a similar case in Slovenia where our response emergency response was taken down by the very same manner. And it was a failure in strategic thinking. I'm not familiar on if that agenda has changed in the past year, but if it hasn't, it should be updated and improved. That answers your question.
It does, certainly, and leads me into my next question. You've also been quoted as saying that the genie is out of the bottle in terms of cyber warfare, and that the cyber World War III is already in full swing. My question is, many observers have pointed out that there's a significant cyber skills gap in our civilian sector. Could you expand and share with the committee what it means for the Canadian Armed Forces that is currently facing a recruitment and retention crisis in its very nascent cyber operations division? Thank you.
Well, as Ukrainian, thank you for your question. As Ukrainian experience has shown, let me put in an example, right? A war cannot be won without the support of native population. I think that is some term that quite sticks, and it is the same in cybersecurity sphere, right? Especially the Western countries, the Americas, kind of relies on its water, right, for defense and on overspending for defense also, but that is not the concept that you can rely on in terms of cyber warfare. So relying on crowdsourced intelligence to utilizing everyone that can help is the way to go, in my opinion. So organizing initiatives and taking into account that just by keeping it closed, a closed loop, it won't solve any problems.
Thank you. And could I leave you with the rest of your time
to? And
go ahead.
Yes, if I may, I would also just take a minute to explain the cyber damages I was talking before, because it's kind of relating to the subject. Just for example, the F-35 program, right, which cost $1.7 trillion to develop in terms of R&D, got hacked by Chinese, and all the plans got stolen. So, and that is just one hack. Now, if we combine everything that together, we get a clearer picture on where the damages are coming from, and that relates both to the Army, to the Air Force, to basically every part of modern society.
Okay, unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. Rather unfortunate point at which to leave it. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes.
So much. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Mr. De Boer, I wanted to ask about, you've spoken about mandatory reporting and things like that, but I also want to dive into a little bit of some of the challenges we've heard in other testimony as well about private sector not necessarily wanting to share if they've been hacked or if their systems are vulnerable. And I could certainly see, for example, of BlackBerry that has a reputation for security. If there was ever a breach, it may not be in the board or the governance of the company to want to necessarily promote that a breach happened or an attack was successful. So how does government partner to understand the real world picture in the private sector, but keeping in mind that the private sector might not be interested in sharing this information?
Thank you for that question. Trust is really important there, that the information that any company will give over to the government will be treated in a confidential way, right? Liability protections, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And currently, that trust has yet to be built fully. One way to get there is, for instance, what the UK or the US is doing, which is to build a joint collaborative environment or a joint, cyber defense collaborative, where there is actually, before an incident happens, channels of communication, for information exchange, threat information exchange, are shared on a voluntary basis oftentimes, where private sector actually gets better understanding of how the information that they give actually is used, flows, and it becomes a true partnership between the private and public sector. Right now, I think the situation is one where there is some hesitancy, right, for regulators, et cetera, to engage. But I think we all recognize that closer public-private partnership is essential.
Thank you. So that clarification is important, because when I hear mandatory reporting, I don't necessarily think that that's confidential. You might, and we've had other testimony that it would be public mandatory reporting so that Canadians have a broader sense. But I think that distinction, at least from that perspective, is interesting. There's also I think a significant onus on individuals or individual corporations to safeguard their security. And you mentioned in your testimony that your organization had a policy of knowing where every component of the product, let's say, comes from. But in examples where companies may have boards and directors and shareholders, where cost effectiveness, that might not be the case. So what would your recommendation be to ensure that the public is more aware of the what they're purchasing, the onus on them, and then what can government do to encourage private sector to not always just look at the bottom line, but the cybersecurity piece?
A huge driver of security, particularly in the automotive sector, has been an emphasis on safety, right? And when consumers start demanding safety or security, that changes. I spoke earlier about a software bill of materials or ingredients list. When we buy things at the grocery store, you know exactly there is an ingredients list there listed, right? There could be, and there's discussion in multiple jurisdictions about, for instance, a cyber safety rating for IoT devices, right? Whether they be your fridge or elsewhere, that could be considered. More awareness about the whether this product is safer than the other could be something for public consumption considered. And I think those are important steps, not just to raise awareness, but to also entice producers to build in security up front, because that's not happening.
This time, thanks.
Colleagues, I need some guidance here. We've run over our hour. First of all, I turn to the clerk and find out, do we know the arrival of our friends? We don't. Okay. I have some committee business that I'd like to do in camera. And we don't know, and we had anticipated that our friends would arrive at 10:15. That gives us 20 minutes, and it does take a few minutes to go in camera. My thought is, because this is such an excellent panel, that we do a kind of like a 2-minute lightning round each party, and just there's stuff that could get out. Is that an acceptable idea? 2 minutes? Okay. So going now, and I'll Conservatives, Liberals, Bloc, and NDP, and then we'll call it regardless. Okay? 2 minutes.
Before you start the clock, I just want to give notice of the following motion, that the committee undertake a study of no less than 8 meetings to review how the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces is impacted by Canada's procurement processes and the capabilities of our defence industry to ensure that the Canadian military needs are being met, and that the Department of National Defence, Canadian Armed Forces, Public Services and Procurement Canada, Office of the Auditor General, Parliamentary Budget Officer, Treasury Board, Defence Industry,
military procurement experts, and academics be invited to testify before committee on this matter, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. And we have that in both official languages, and we'll circulate. If I can start my lightning round of questions. So first of all, I just want to thank all the witnesses for being here, and just want to. The government has proposed Bill C-26 as a way to encourage industry to have stronger cybersecurity defense, and there's been a lot of concerns raised that the fines and penalties are overly prescriptive and brutal in finding individuals and companies, but yet that same type of types of fines and penalties aren't applied to the government itself. And so I'd like to get feedback from Mr. De Boer, in particular being a Canadian industry here. And I do miss my BlackBerry phone from back in the day. But I would just ask, who's responsible? Is it Canadian Armed Forces, Department of National Defence, CSC, Government of Canada as a whole in protecting critical infrastructure, including in the private sector? Or is that best to come from the individual companies? And if you also can touch on the issue around available people, because based upon the Business Council of Canada, they say that we have 25,000 unfilled positions currently in the cybersecurity world.
So who is responsible? It's unclear. I mean, that was part of my testimony is we need to clarify roles and responsibility. And that doesn't exist right now. We don't have a unity of effort. When it comes to C-26, it's an important start. We are late to the game when it comes to mandatory reporting in critical infrastructure on cyber incidents. So we welcome that initiative, but it's limited to 4 sectors, right? And the reality is there's a lot of policy action happening right now. The critical infrastructure strategy is being renewed. It was drafted in 2009. Cyber isn't even mentioned, right? And then we've got the National Cyber Strategy, Bill C-26. All of these need to be united.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Who's speaking for the Liberals? Mr. Fairshire, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, folks, for being here. I appreciate your testimony today. I've asked this question previously. I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. How can Canada better partner with the private sector to raise the cybersecurity bar across the country? Now, yesterday I read a story about in the CBC about Halifax Water, and there was a test of their cybersecurity. Emails were sent to 55 people. 45 of them responded, clicked the link, and sent all of their information. We talk about mandatory reporting. We talk about the importance of critical infrastructure. When we think about that infrastructure, Halifax Water, or we think about public utilities across our country, as it pertains to mandatory reporting, as it pertains to sharpening their cybersecurity pencils. Interested in your thoughts. We'll start with you, Mr. De Boer, and maybe move to Mr. McSorley in the short time we have. Thank you.
So very quickly, AI-driven cybersecurity tools. If that would have been used in the Colonial Pipeline, our 2015 model would have stopped it. So use advanced technology, and they can help in the personnel issue, but also protect critical infrastructure.
Thank you. I'll mention another bill here. Currently, the government is looking at the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And so I think if we are, I agree with Mr. De Boer that we need to be looking at innovative solutions, including AI, but we also need to make sure that we have regulations in place. And there's wide concerns, both private sector and civil society, that there are problems with what's contained in the AI and Data Act right now.
Ms. Normandin, 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Like Mr. Bezan's question, for you, Mr. De Boer, you said that in the United States or in Australia, there are cyber ministers, and Christian Luprick, a witness, told us that Denmark has cyber ambassadors. What kind of position could we envisage here? Do you have recommendations? What characteristics could such a position entail?
So the primary role of such an individual, it could be a parliamentary secretary, would first of all just signal to all Canadians that cybersecurity is important. Second, it would be one individual empowered with ensuring policy coherence and program coherence across Canada, right? Currently, that does not exist. And, you know, I mentioned the Australian case, but the UK also has a parliamentary secretary responsible for cybersecurity. We used to have a parliamentary secretary for digital, right? That is no longer the case. So I think, you know, the role would be to look across the government of Canada to ensure coherence, unity of effort, and to unify our approach to defending the country.
Inaudible.
I think, you know, we do need a centralized office to engage with cybersecurity. One of the questions we have around C26 is it's not clear whether this would fall under existing national security review bodies. And so having an agency that's both tasked with ensuring that cybersecurity is handled properly, but also that is tasked with ensuring that it's reviewed and accountable and that there's transparency around it would be important as well.
Ms. Masson, final 2 minutes.
Yes. So in this committee, we've heard a lot about the over classification of information that Canadians classify 90% of what they or 90% is what is not needed to be classified. So, Mr. McSorley, in terms of that over classification of intelligence, how does that create a barrier or problems for civil rights organizations to hold the community that those intelligence agencies truly accountable? And what is your solution to that?
Thank you very much for the question. I'd say that it isn't just a concern among civil liberties and civil society groups, but across many sectors in Canada, that there needs to be a trust developed, that there needs to be openness and transparency to the degree where we understand what Canadian agencies, including the CSC, are engaging in when they engage in protecting Canada's cybersecurity, when they engage in active and defensive cyber operations, and when they engage in signals intelligence. The way to ensure that that's happening is to have greater mandatory reporting around the activities that they're carrying out. So, for example, there's a lack of mandatory reporting in C26 right now. So it would be very difficult to track ways that it's used, but also whether or not there's any failings so that we can improve the system. Oversight and review isn't simply about putting organizations on the defensive and calling them out, but also seeing where we can learn from our errors and improve the operations. And so, you know, there's right now the Intelligence Commissioner and then NCIRA, and as I mentioned, it's not clear that they have a role in reviewing Canada's cybersecurity operations because they touch on national security, but not necessarily in the way that those bodies always review it. So we think there either needs to be a new position or amendments made to their mandate so it clarifies that they do have that mandate.
Thank you, Ms. Masson. Mr. Nared, I saw that you had your hand up there. It's disadvantageous to be virtual when everyone else is physically present. So let me give you a minute or two to comment on
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be very quick. Just an idea on how to quickly improve cybersecurity is to make the IT industry, right, the whole IT industry accountable. That means software and hardware,